Carrickfergus, where there aren't any nuclear power plants, on the long and winding road, down to the salty sea, salty and radioactive sea. And in Kilkenny, it is reported, on marble stones there, as black as any ink, with gold and silver, I would support her. But I'll sing no more now, till I get a drink. But I'm drunken now, and I'm seldom sober. A handsome rover from town to town. Oh, but I'm sick now, and me days are numbered. So come all ye young lads, and lay me down. There you go, that's a mic check. I start singing that with my wife around and she gets very sad and it makes me stop. So whenever she's not around, I can let loose. Oh, well, thank you all for coming. This is a good turnout for our annual meeting. We're going to go quickly through the business portion of the meeting. Maybe not too quickly if we then leads us to the next session and they're not here, right? Maggie's next, right, Clay? 2:45?
No, Ray.
Ray is next. Oh, well, Ray is here, so then we can be quick and then Ray can have extra time. There's no formal agenda prepared for the meeting, so you can all take pot shots at any time. I'm going to briefly review the meeting from last year. We had minutes, and this is our sort of will suffice for our minutes for last year. We accepted the minutes from the previous meeting of 2014, which were, I'm sure, available to all comers and interesting. And then we took reports from President, myself, Ned Childs, and Treasurer Jim Kirby, who's no longer our treasurer. Jim retired from the board, and Skylar Gould has taken on the burden of corporate treasurer. We presented Lifetime Achievement Awards to Lou and Judy Friedman, accepted by their daughter Kimberly Friedman of Newfane. And since that time, I think most of you know, Lou and Judy both passed on in a heroic show of mutual respect to each other. And when simultaneously, when I think the situation really didn't look good anymore for Lou, but they were.
Where's Judy? They were both in.
Judy and Lou both in terminal pain, and but they were really a great pair. And then Caroline from Fairwinds accepted an award on behalf of Maggie and Arnie, who are going to be presenting later today, assuming they don't get trapped in the flash flood on their way down from Burlington. And then we had a presentation from Gordon Edwards of the Canadian, what is it? Ray, help me out. The
Committee for Nuclear Responsibility.
Committee for Nuclear Responsibility. Canadian
Committee for Nuclear.
Yeah, which is kind of like a Canadian Beyond Nuclear. It addresses nuclear issues all over Canada. And Canada's not, in the last few years, been eclipsed by Kazakhstan, as you probably know, but for many years was the Saudi Arabia of uranium. So, and yet it's not a closed deal, because in Quebec, they have a moratorium on any use of uranium. In Quebec and I believe Newfoundland, not Nova Scotia, not New Brunswick, just put in a reactor, but I think Newfoundland and Quebec have a moratorium in their provinces against the use of uranium. So now I left a pile of these letters. One bit of our updated bylaws that we dealt with last year is that at the annual meeting, the president, in this case myself, for the last 5 years, presents a letter to the group, and so I'm going to read you this letter, and there are copies back on the table if you feel you need to check on what I said. So greetings to you all and welcome to our nuclear-free Brattleboro.
Second year anniversary.
Or so it would seem. It's not quite so nuclear-free as we... Another year has slipped by. Spent fuel canisters have been ordered. The new storage pad is being readied. Any plans for prompt decommissioning are not evident. We at the New England Coalition were unsuccessful this past year in our efforts to slow this waste fuel storage train. We had hoped to provide a moment for fundamental review of the 60-year SAF store. Some call it safe store, but it doesn't seem very safe, so we call it SAF store option. Yet even so, we soldier on in our core mission to provide the watchdog function of a skeptical observer. And there's a lot more to that, and Ray will go into it. In this case, with our local focus on the Vermont Yankee site, we're hoping to achieve a best practices decommissioning, and Ray will explain that at greater length. I have been asked most recently by my attorney, so now you all know that I have an attorney, and he's an old family friend, why does the coalition go on now that Vermont Yankee is closed? My short answer, everybody's short answer, is because the high-level waste, the spent nuclear fuel, remains on site. And here's an echo from last year's meeting, where Gordon Thompson suggested we consider ourselves entering a new geologic age, the age of nuclear waste management. As you all know, it is not a trivial matter. So now we digress into Ned's editorializing. The sad part of all this is that we have to concern ourselves with the back end of the uranium fuel cycle at all. For centuries, scientists had pursued the mysteries of the fundamental building blocks of nature in a quest for truth and understanding of natural processes and elements, and this led inevitably to the awesome discovery of natural radioactive decay. These early atomic insights, even before World War I, the time of Frederick Soddy and Rutherford and others, led to forecasts at that time of an atomic future with abundant energy for all purposes. The dream was sown of an impending atomic energy future. A few decades later, in the 30s, chain reactions produced for weapons programs as well as for plutonium production led to the push for uranium fission to power electricity, civilian electricity production plants. All these weapons tests and later the large-scale power reactors produce artificial isotopes of normal elements, which are highly toxic, carcinogenic, mutagenic, and I don't know if leukemia-genic is a word, so I say produce leukemia. The truly tragic and ironic fact that all these horrible poisons and toxins, which we concern ourselves, will have such a dangerous legacy for future generations of life on our planet were never necessary to produce in the first place. They are truly the unintended bad consequences of good intentions. Uranium fission was conceived by some in government and industry as a necessary industrial imperative. It has proved to be a powerful illusion. The dreams of Jules Verne and later Hyman Rickover for an atomic-powered submarine which could cruise underwater for months was realized in the USS Nautilus, launched in 1954. Maybe some of you can remember where you were in 1954. I was -2.
Jimmy Carter.
There you go. The successes of this novel ship propelled the United States government and its industry partners to push forward the rash, editorial word, and unnecessary build-out of light water reactors all over the globe. Canada sold heavy water reactors, the Russians persisted with graphite moderated units, and the French and British pursued a gas-cooled variety. And eventually the US light water systems using lightly enriched uranium or low enriched uranium became predominant. But the modern uranium boom was first and foremost an American effort, so we have some responsibility here. Other countries also pushed for the vain dream of a progressive, scientific, high-prestige nuclear power program, but the United States pushed hardest of all at the Geneva Atoms for Peace meetings in the 1950s, even assembling a small-scale operating reactor in downtown Geneva, if you can believe it. Not so hard to believe, there's also one on Mass Ave in Cambridge, right at MIT, next to the Student Center, in case you didn't know. 4-megawatt thermal, not connected to the grid. President Eisenhower, in '54, famously pushed the Atoms for Peace button, and yet he seemed to regret it upon leaving office with his admonition to beware the military-industrial complex. Ike's successor, I was going to use Ike's first name, but I don't know that I know. What was Eisenhower's first name? Dwight. There you go, Dwight. Now it sounds obvious. Anyway, Dwight's successor, John Kennedy, ordered a review of the entire civilian nuclear power program in 1962. From Glenn Seaborg, Nobel Prize-winning discoverer of plutonium, 1939, his scientific advisor at the time. So Seaborg had invented this plutonium, so he clearly wanted his discovery to save the world from an energy crisis. Somebody else called it fiendishly toxic. Basically, Seaborg lied to JFK, saying that the problems with nuclear power reactors had been largely worked out. They hadn't. They still hadn't come up with emergency core cooling systems, and they, as you all know. And that the age of inexpensive atomic and electric power was at hand. We will probably never know if a resurgent skepticism on Kennedy's part, which came about, if you read the reports, when his son Patrick died, suffering from effects that were mimicked radiation poisoning in utero. So a case for a resurgent skepticism in 1963 on Kennedy's part of the large-scale build-out of uranium fission power plants, civilian power plants, had anything to do with his untimely assassination that were left hanging there. Almost done. In Britain, maybe some of you know, just recently a new nuclear power plant, a twin reactor, was finally green-lighted at Hinkley Point in Somerset on the English Channel. This twin EPR unit station, that's the European power reactor, the French unit. There are 4 under construction worldwide, 2 in China, 1 in Finland, 1 in France, at Flamanville, and none of them have been shown to be successful. But the British just decided, well, that's good enough for us. You're almost there. We'll buy 2. But at 25 billion euros, this will be the most costly single capital project ever undertaken by any industry. The cost nearly equals, for you business school wonks, the market capitalization of the sponsoring entity. Électricité de France, 85% owned by the French government. In the rosiest forecast, Hinkley Point will not come online until 2025. British electric consumers will be locked into paying double or triple the going rate for electricity to benefit this white elephant project. How could such a thing happen? Well, there are several suggestions. I suggest it happened because the British government, at its highest levels, insists on having a nuclear submarine navy with a nuclear-capable strike force. And the British became worried that competent sailors for their nuclear navy could not be found if there was not a credible nuclear-powered job sector and market for their retiring nuclear navy sailors. So the lesson here, I suggest, is that atomic power plants, at any cost, are only justifiable as a matter of empire, if you know what I mean. Save the Queen. So it is that we at New England Coalition intend to soldier on to spread our message of the truth about uranium. The age of the imperative of uranium fission needs to end. We have soiled the planet unnecessarily with excess radon gas and its deadly daughters at the uranium mines, when it would have been better and more prudent to leave the ore in the ground. People need to be told what has been done in their name if there is ever to be any hope in changing our ways. We here at the New England Coalition hope to cast the message forth that uranium is a poison ore. It is neither needed nor wanted anymore. There's a rhyme there. Maybe a Bob Dylan song. The wastes that we have created need to be isolated from contact with the biosphere for many thousands of years. It is not a job to be taken lightly, and yet few of our fellow citizens seem to be aware of the awful dangers so blithely engaged on our behalf. So as we refocus our efforts to achieve a best practices decommissioning for our local nuclear reactor, all these historical considerations begin to hit home. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for your support in this ongoing Sisyphean task at hand. Sincerely yours, Ned Childs. And their copies in back. Thank you very much. Now we'll bring up Skylar for a brief financial report of the 2015 year and a glimpse at the present.
Very brief.
Go for it, Skylar.
This is the easiest task I've ever done. Thanks. Thanks, Ned. Thanks, everybody. It's a little embarrassing because it's so straightforward.
Who are you? Who are you?
He wants to do it through introduce
I want you to
yourself.
introduce yourself.
And speak into the mic.
I'm Skylar.
There you go, into the
Just
mic.
introduce me. I know who I am. Thank you. So at the start of 2015, it's hard to grasp what these figures mean in the context of the nuclear industry. We had basically $7,900 in the bank. We took in $64,000 this past year, for 2015. We had expenses of $67,000, and we now, at the end of the year, we had roughly $5,000 in the bank.
How much?
5,000. I don't think we have that much now. I should know, as the treasurer. I understand that you know, raising money is a difficult task, and it's hard to ask people to contribute. I do ask you to contribute. I ask you as well to think creatively about all in your wildest imagination how whom we might approach for monies. As Ned touched on, as we shift our focus, and we're still shifting our focus, and we want all of you and more to help us with this shift and redefining our mission in the world. But certainly public education is probably the greatest task that we have ahead of us. And so we are thinking about projects, discrete projects, which we can seek grant monies for, as well as gifts to carry those out. Here come Arnie and Maggie, that's nice. So please keep us in mind, and thank you.
Thank you, Skylar. I will give a little context to that. We talked about it last year, and it's going on. I don't know if I gave a time frame last year, but I spoke in terms of several years, transitioning from a group with an operating reactor in the neighborhood that was clearly a danger to life and property, to people who think about such things, to a post-active reactor community, such as San Onofre and Kewanee, and increasingly in the years to come, there will be many more communities like us. And so while you read in the paper how the state is worried about the workers and the retraining and the Vernon tax base, we're not so concerned about that. We're concerned about keeping some people interested about the danger that goes on. And we're transitioning kind of back to a volunteer, involuntarily, frankly, back to a volunteer organization, because our traditional fundraising dropped off about by half. We were in the 100 to 120 range on an annualized basis for a number of years. In the last 5 years, let's say, of the reactor operating. And so now we're operating at about half that level, but we continue to pay down our indebtedness, and we're really making big strides there. But transitioning into a mode of public education and the watchdog, the local watchdog of a post-operating plant, and finding how to make that relevant to our funding base, our members, and people who haven't thought to be members. I think back in my own case, I was in Harvard Square during the Seabrook days in 1977, and seeing the people walk down the streets, the young girls with no nukes on their t-shirt. You think you're in college, you know everything, right? No nukes. I thought, oh, well, that's silly. It should say lots of nukes. What do you mean no nukes? We got nuclear bombs, we got nuclear submarines, we got nuclear power plants. What do you mean no nukes? Well, clearly she meant we should have no nukes, you know, but that was lost on me. And so there's a lot of people like that out there that don't get it. And they don't really want to get it. They're happier listening to Donald Trump or the football game or the crime show, you know, so maybe there is an opportunity for humor there. I mean, I was watching Michael Moore today, and he's, you know, on the Lawrence O'Donnell show there, and there isn't a way for humor to maybe make these messages more palatable. But there you are, Arnie and Maggie, welcome. So that's the context of our annual, of our treasurer's report, that we're still here. We're not going anywhere, but we're going to try extra hard to reaffirm why we're relevant and to make that relevance apparent to a new cast of characters. So help us do that in any way, whether tonight at the open mic or at any time throughout the year. So now, Clay, where does that bring us to in terms of our official agenda? I think turn it over to Ray. All right.
I'd just like to say we still have treats here. We have coffee. I'll try to keep that all going. You know, feel free to get up and partake during the meeting. Do we have a vote? Do we need to approve minutes?
I don't think we do.
Okay.
No, I think and Jake, dive in here. You're the longest serving board member, but we we would have, if there were nominations for new board members, we'd get into that now, but I don't think we have any. Or whether we have, there was something about a 3-year cycle, I'm not sure.
Take a vote now to accept the minutes that you just presented.
All right, well.
I moved the minutes from last year and the financial report.
All right, do we have a second?
Second.
There's a second, so all in favor of accepting the minutes and the financial report as presented, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The motion carries. All right, so and again, I think we have no new board members to consider at this time, and I don't know if we're in a staggered session if we consider. We're kind of at a loss here, because it was first year we've operated at this level without Carol.
Without Carol!
Lori, save us.
I don't know if this is appropriate, and if it's not, somebody please correct me. I'd like to open the floor up for nominations. If anyone has anyone they'd like to nominate, if anyone would like to nominate themselves. We're a fun-loving, in spite of the nature of the work we do, we're a fun-loving, warm group, and we work hard, and we sure share this mission of trying to help keep the planet a little safer for our children and grandchildren, and beyond that by many, many generations. So if there's anyone that has anyone they'd like to nominate, including themselves, please don't be shy. You won't regret
And
it.
it's also an open process throughout the year. You don't have to wait till the annual meeting to visit the board meeting and maybe join the board on a provisional basis and then come to an annual meeting, the next available annual meeting, and be voted officially as a member. But you can sort of join us as a working board member or a volunteer at any time. So it's not like if you feel on the edge of your seat that you'd like to do it, but I've got one more thing to do, you can talk to us in a couple of weeks and we'll still be there. Right, Lori? But
I'd like to add a little discussion on that, is that for some of you that have already been board members, you have probably more to offer than you would think in getting ready for this year's meeting, and actually over the past year. There's really pieces that people that have been a board member, have not been a board member. It can take just a tiny bit of input, can make a huge difference when you're as lean as we are. You know, it's it might be 4 hours a month. You don't have to go to meetings. You can help from home. There's without laying out this long list of ways people can be involved. Someone hung a flyer up in Putney, and someone I spoke with yesterday said, I asked, how'd you find out about it? And they said, I saw the flyer in Putney. And it's like, that's great. All it took was that one flyer. So it need not be a huge investment like going to a monthly meeting in Brattleboro and having to make these big decisions that, somehow I ended up on the board, and it's only because I went to a meeting in 2008 as a volunteer and thought, well, I'll see how I can help. So thank you, Lori, who's a board member and our resident attorney, not in regulatory law, but so there, I've made my pitch.
Yeah, the current board, I think we're all here. Jake Stewart, longest presiding, and then Ray Shaddis, Edgecombe, Maine. Everybody, I hope everybody knows. If you don't, then there's a problem. Myself from Dummerston, Clay from Townsend, and then we have Lori from Brattleboro / Putney in transition, and Skylar Gould from up north, Barry, Montpelier area, and also Brattleboro part-time. So who did I forget?
Sylvia.
Well, and then Sylvia is in our emeritus.
I'm just saying I'd be willing to go back to, if I could work from home.
Yeah, we have a conference call.
I nominate Sylvia.
Second.
As secretary, or?
Whatever she's willing.
Well, whatever.
Secretary, no, I did that
A board member.
for years.
We'll just take her as a board
Well,
member.
that's wonderful.
Thank you, Sylvia.
If I could work from home.
Would you, all right, now you've been nominated to join our board. Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you so much. Would you like to stand up and make a brief remark?
Or sit.
I didn't prepare a speech. I'm a former president of the group and secretary, and it's a group I believe in very deeply, very much, and I am glad to be able to help wherever I can.
Thank you, Sylvia.
Beautifully said. All right.
He knows me well.
Has been a main, or was a mainstay for a long time in our group, and knows the ins and outs of what we've been doing and so forth. And I have not been to Brattleboro every month, but operate by phone, which is much easier to do now. So that makes it a lot easier
That
for
encourages
people
me,
to,
yes.
or anybody
Yes.
else
Yes, I really can.
that's inclined that way. We can just do a call-in, which works very well.
Well, it helped with our gender diversity too, because Lori was starting to feel a little threatened because the only female. Ray.
I move Sylvia's acceptance as a trustee by acclamation. All those in favor?
All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? No, we're not supposed to ask that. It's unanimous. Thank you, Sylvia. You're welcome back on the board, and we'll go easy on you. Give you the call-in numbers.
I did break my hip this year, so.
Okay, well, then take it double easy. So now, I think that brings us to the part of the, go ahead.
Just a tiny bit more discussion. One of the things I wanted to pull off for this meeting was to invite area schools to send, I wanted to get 1 or 2 students from each of the area schools to be here to, I'm sure, because I know that the schools have climate change clubs and sustainability clubs, and we need to involve the next generation for sure, and get people that are familiar with using computers. And that's the kind of thing, it wouldn't take, I don't think, much for someone to reach to the schools and say, hey, you know, do you want to send a couple of students? And it's just an example of a distinct task that could be taken on. So.
All right then I think that closes the business section of the meeting, but go ahead, Lori.
I'm not sure if anyone came in after we announced that we were opening the floor for nominations for the board, including self-nominations. So if anyone arrived after we made that statement, that's where we are in our meeting. It's not too late. Jump up.
Okay, we got Sylvia.
Yes.
We're gonna push our luck. Now we've talked to a bunch of you over the course of the year, and it's an open situation, especially for past members. Go off for a number of years, but feel free to come back on and share your insights. We're still treading over the same ground, but I'd like really to give it to Ray and have him give you a chance to share your thoughts. If everybody else is okay. And otherwise, take some pot shots, please. Ray, the floor is yours.
More technologically advanced than I am. One of my favorite cartoons was in the New Yorker, and it showed this crowd in what looked like Red Square, maybe, or someplace in China. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people spread across the square mile or so, and then in the far distance there was a huge monumental platform and podium and so on. And then up on top of the podium there were three tiny little figures, apparently dressed in top coats, looking severe, but there they were way back there. So you've all seen that kind of picture. But in the crowd there were two people that were leaning together, and one was saying, "Oh no, not another PowerPoint presentation." When Maine Yankee closed, suddenly it was really hard to find an anti-nuclear activist anywhere. I mean, people said it was over, and they kind of dropped off the scope. I had a delegation come down to the farm from the Maine Nuclear Referendum Committee. And they said, "Well, that's it, you're our point man now, Ray." But what we found with that plant is that they released to the local environment a larger radioactive inventory than they shipped off in containers and those monthly shipments down to the Carolinas. We saw the trucks with huge sealed containers with the radiation symbols on them, heavily laden tractor-trailer trucks going out, on average about once a month, for the 24 years that the plant operated. In that same time, liquid, airborne, inadvertent solid releases, they put more radioactivity into the site than they shipped away. We'll try this this PowerPoint here, because we're talking now about this little site, comparatively small, Main Yankee ran about 700 acres. This is about a 100-acre site. And the industrialized portion of the site is a relatively small portion of that 100 acres. So we're really talking about a small patch of the earth. The Vernon Preserve. This is wordsmithing and showmanship. Initially, I proposed to the Board of Trustees that we put together a fund called the Hunts Meadow Restoration Fund. As you all know, one of the very early governors of Vermont came from Vernon, and his house is part of the estate that the company bought to establish the nuclear plant. And the leftover mansion, as it's called, the modest mansion, is kind of the gatehouse, the welcoming center for Vermont Yankee nuclear power station. On doing some research, I found out that there is indeed a Hunts Meadow, but it's not in Vernon. It's in South Brattleboro. What's the lumber yard? CHERNOBYL? Circassian?
Yeah,
Fine. Adjacent to the lumber yard in South Brattleboro. In the river is Hunts Meadow. It's a big flat area, kind of like a bay inset from the river, where a lot of ice fishing goes on. And you go by there in the wintertime and see all the ice shed. That, for some reason, is called Hunts Meadow. So that blew that idea. That blew that idea. This is the next best idea. And I want to convey some sense of preciousness. I'll have to get my button man here.
You have to be on the mic so they can hear you on the tape.
Thank you, man.
Take it off.
So, Clay,
You can walk around with it.
You can walk around with it, you can take it out of the stand.
you think?
Yeah.
This, so you can see.
But stay in the light.
Can we go to the next slide, please?
Sure.
Thank you.
You can pull that out and walk with it. There you go, then
Yeah,
you can hear you.
You can really do your Elvis.
So, the life stream for New England is this thing called the Connecticut River, and it's the lifeblood for this site and for all of eastern Vermont. And the next slide. Let's try the next slide, please. Hello. Could you stand back so that I could just give you a little signal we can move on? Yeah. It's a beautiful natural wonder. First settled by America's first people back around 9,000 or 10,000 years ago. And they tread lightly on the land. The original environmental report for the construction of Vermont Yankee says that very few Indian artifacts were found, and those were scattered. That's because damn near everything they owned was biodegradable, except the rocks. These happen to be up at Bellows Falls. These are petroglyphs. Those designs are chipped into the rock. And that little bit of loving graffiti is about all the trace that the Abenaki people left for their settlement along the river. They didn't just live with nature, They live in it and of it, and they did not consider themselves stewards of all of the fish, animals, birds, all the creatures, all the biota. They considered themselves kin, brothers and sisters to all of these living things. There are also petroglyphs left by the first people down in Vernon, except with the construction of the Vernon Dam, that portion of the river where they left their marks is flooded. And so those designs are underwater. Let's go to another one. Good. All this nature stuff is wonderful. But when the first settlers came in, they didn't view this as a natural wonder to be preserved. They saw it as an opportunity. So one of the very first things we did was to build mills along the river, use it to catch the waste discharge from our factories, from the sewage plants, and so on. So the Connecticut River really became one big open waste discharge plant. No end of ambition. I'm not sure when they started construction, siting and construction, but I think about 66. That's when we started in May. And this is the Vermont Yankee under construction, with scaffolding around it. You kind of have to contrast that to the first picture of the river. This is another vision for that site. This is the core, the center of that reactor under construction. But, as you know, no foolproof machine is damn foolproof. If people can bungle stuff, they will. And they're also not leak-proof. This is a fuzzy photo. I had a sharp one, don't know where it went, of the trench that they dug alongside the reactor building, alongside the auxiliary or augmented off-gas treatment system, where the tritium leak occurred that caused so much consternation. One thing you should know about that tritium leak, or remember, because you may know this already, but just kind of keep in mind that when they excavated the trench to find a hole in the pipe, they also found other radionuclides. Not just tritium, but strontium, I believe, and also cesium-137. And they found in easily detectable levels in the soil as they excavated that trench. This little quote here from Albert Schweitzer, who was a really leading figure back in the 1950s. You wouldn't remember, Ned.
Yeah.
But I do. He was a doctor, a humanitarian, and a highly respected commentator and a philosopher of the science world. Here, Sally, could I get you to read a statement? Dr. Schweitzer, you're a good reader, right? Sure you are.
Yeah, but we're in contact, so it depends on how.
Weird contacts?
Yeah, weird contacts.
How about that? Can you read that?
Which one? The whole thing from the
Yeah.
beginning? Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Now?
I just want to put it in context.
Okay, go for it.
This statement by Schweitzer was reprinted by a Kennedy Commission, Senator Kennedy Commission, on radioactive releases to the state of Utah from the nuclear weapons testing, where the federal government said there was no harm, people were dying like flies, and the sheep pastured in the mountains actually had radiation burns on their faces from trying to eat the foliage. Yeah.
It was all denied by the AEC.
Well,
All for the mic.
Go.
let's go for it.
Great.
Here's the mic.
Oh.
Yeah.
I raise my voice, together with those of others who have lately felt it their duty to act, in speaking and writing as warners of the danger. My age and the sympathy that I have gained for myself through advocating the idea of reverence for life permit me to hope that my appeal may contribute to preparing the way for insight so urgently needed. From official and unofficial sources, we have been assured time and time again that the increase in the radioactivity in the air does not exceed the amount which the human body can tolerate without harmful effects. This is just evading the problem. Even if not directly affected by the radioactive material in the air, we are indirectly affected by that which has fallen down, is falling down, and will fall down. We are absorbing this through radioactive drinking water and through animal and vegetable foodstuffs to the same extent as radioactive elements are stored in the vegetation of the region in which we live. Unfortunately for us, nature hoards what is falling from the air. What this storing of radioactive material implies by observations made when, on one occasion, the radioactivity of the Columbia River in North America was analyzed. The radioactivity was caused by the atomic plants at Hanford, which produce atomic energy for industrial purposes and which empty their wastewater into the rivers. The radioactivity of the water was insignificant, but the radioactivity of the river plankton was 2,000 times higher, that of the ducks eating the plankton 40,000 times higher, that of the fish 150,000 times higher. In young swallows fed on insects caught by their parents in the river, the radioactivity was 500,000 times higher, and in the egg yolks of water birds, more than 1,000,000 times higher. That radioactive elements created by us are found in nature is an astounding event in the history of the earth and of the human race. To fail to consider its importance and its consequences would be a folly for which humanity would have to pay a terrible price. Albert Schweitzer, 1957.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. So, just to take it to the local level here. Any horror stories you hear about Fukushima or Chernobyl or the nuclear weapons testing outfall are copied here, maybe in small scale. The quantities are many orders of magnitude less. But the contamination is there in full, none the less. And what that means for people in the biota is cancer, genetic illness, and birth defects. at Chernobyl, we've stacked up countless reports going back almost to the time of the accident. That was 1986. Within a decade, we had researchers, I'm thinking of some people from the University of Georgia in particular, that went there and reported on the rodent population. There had been introduced genetic variation in that population, as much as the difference between a mouse and a rat. A large band of mutations. The report was featured on the front page of, on the cover of Newsweek. And alarm sounded from Chernobyl. The scientist Ron Chesser had his funding withdrawn at the university. The paper that he produced was chewed up by his colleagues out there in the academic world, by the nuclear industry, by the regulatory agencies. The story was also carried in the New York Times as the second one up there about voles. Voles are a little mouse-like critter. And that was yes, that was 1996. But a second story from the Academy of Finland reports the same phenomenon in 2016. So I didn't know the Finns were into nuclear. I need to point out, I keep mentioning biosphere, and this is a living community. We, like the first people, we're not separate from it. Our bodies within and without depend on a whole world of microbes to keep us up and moving around. The living community that is affected could be isolated for a brief time, but not for very long in the history of the world. We depend on them, all of the creatures in that biotic community. In Chernobyl, the forests are not rotting down. What it means is a change in the microbial life that processes that wood fiber to turn it into nutrients for the plants and animals that live off of plants and so on. It's like a broken link in a very vital chain. And it's all over that area. So this is self-explanatory. That's a vole, by the way, that's not a mouse. But yeah, clean it up. And whatever you leave is going to plague all of the biota that are there. Good. I just want a word about the radiation in the biota before we flip off here. I talked to people who were involved in making the decision in Germany to go with a big cast iron storage cask as opposed to a big concrete cask with a sheet metal can inside of it. And they made that decision because, I was told, they made that decision because they feared that the can in a concrete cask system depended on having air brought in the bottom of the cask, drawn up along the sides of the canister, and expelled from the top of the cask. That's the cooling system. Convection cooling, remember? Convection cooling, fine. They said, what happens to the airborne microbes that are drawn through this system 24 hours a day in that volume of air that goes up through there and is irradiated? Their fear was that they would become mutated, that you would have a microbe mutation factory in each of the casks. When it comes to what we currently have at Vermont Yankee, it will have its effect for as long as 10 or 20 half-lives of any given isotope. Some of the alpha emitters, hard to detect radionuclides like plutonium or americium. Plutonium, 24,000 year half-life, so 10 or 20 of those, and it should be down to undetectable levels. This symbol, by the way, is the official international replacement for that old yellow circle with the purple radii on it. You know, that triangular sort of pie-looking thing. I think this one's very explicit. The nuclear industry hates it. Yeah. All right. One quick word about this site. We don't have a full measure of how contaminated the site is. Neither does Vermont Yankee. They did a preliminary survey in 2014, but it was a paper chase. They basically went to the records and they said, where have we had releases and where has material been reported? Anecdotally, we get spots, and so we get a picture. Keep in mind that heavier radionuclides were found when they did the tritium investigation. They never said where they came from. They never extended the search to look further for it. But we know they're there because they reported them. Okay. In 1998, they had a leak in what's called the chemistry sink. This is a place where they tap the coolant lines in the reactor and assay what they get from that tap for its radioactive content. They had a leak in the drain of that sink. It went on for nobody knows quite how long, but they wound up with a very large plume of radionuclides underneath that portion of the turbine building. The NRC said, well, you fixed the leak. The turbine building has this foundation all around it. You're down in there. It's unlikely that there's going to be a lot of flow of water through it. So it's not going to, in all likelihood, it won't migrate very much. Leave it there until decommissioned. So what's in that plume? It's everything, all 200 plus major radionuclides that are produced in the reactor. That's what would be coming out in that sampling. So we know about that. In the cooling towers at Vermont Yankee, the water that's flowing down through those cooling towers with the fans blowing the vapor out, that water contains a lot of solids, a lot of suspended solid material. In an operating nuclear plant, that represents a health hazard because it comes out with a spray that goes out of the side of the cooling towers and floats into people's lungs, and the particles are small enough to cause real damage in the lungs. So, but the particles, solid particles, accumulate in the bottom of those cooling towers. Did you know they keep a little bulldozer in the pools so that they can move the silt, the sludge, or call it what you will, the solid particle material that accumulates in the bottom of the cooling towers? In, I think also 98, and then more recently with the new owners in 2005, 2006, they got permission from the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission to take that silt along with sand and soil and salt from the plowing that goes on around their sidewalks and driveways and stuff, and stack it up, yard it, between the cooling towers on the south end of the site. The last time I checked, there were only 10 or 12 large dump truck loads of this material stacked out there. It is laced through with a full inventory of radionuclides. We asked Vermont Yankee very plainly when we were before the Vermont Public Service Board with them, you know, we asked them real plainly, where's it coming from? And their answer was straightforward, we don't know. So it's not a leak-proof system. When in 2003, when they were looking for permission to yard yet more sanding salts and sand from their roads, we found that it was radioactively contaminated. This is out there walking around. So we said, we had Charlie Thayer, is that his name? No.
Something else.
Jay.
I'm mixing him up with the main Yankee guy. We had Jay Thayer on the stand. And we said, where's it coming from? He said, well, probably the workers have tracked it out of the plant, going, you know, when they leave the plant, they probably tracked it out onto the sidewalk and then away. And I said, well, how did they get through your radiation monitors that you have to go through entering and leaving the plant? And he said, well, it wasn't concentrated enough to be detected. And I said, and I have a transcript for this, and it's really fun. I said, do you mean, Mr. Thayer, that it was too low a concentration to be detected when they were walking out with it, but that somehow it concentrated out there in the wind and rain and on the sidewalk? And so yes, yes, for sure. It's a contaminated site. We won't know how badly it is contaminated, but every plant that I've dealt with, Maine Yankee, Connecticut Yankee, Yankee Road, they have all claimed that their plant was contamination proof, that there was nothing to be found. And when they got into decommissioning, they all complained about the cost of all of the material that they had to remove. Because indeed, it turned out that there was contamination where they least suspected it. No surprise, there are different standards for how clean you make a site. At Maine Yankee, citizens, at Connecticut Yankee, the state of Connecticut, at Yankee Row, the state of Massachusetts, pushed that limit, that upper limit, down so low that the radiation could not be detected with handheld or portable instruments on site. It had to be sampled and shipped to a laboratory where it could be counted over long periods of time. That is, the individual radioactive emissions could be counted over long periods of time so that they could get a reading. Some of it could be detected with hand instruments, but most of it not. That's how low we pushed it. And what we did was we brought those plants, the states, and the Maine citizens, we brought those plants into line with early recommendations of the EPA and of the environmental community for what those standards should be in terms of being protective of human health and, from my point of view, also the whole biota. And the question is, does this site here at Vernon, do the people and the environment and our biotic community here in Vermont deserve any less protection? If so, someone has to say why you and your environment are not deserving of at least the protection that was afforded in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Maine.
Well, it's going to Massachusetts and Connecticut, isn't it, down the river?
Oh, and now, real quick, there's talk about bringing other industry in on the site. That's stupid and dangerous for two reasons. It is dangerous because the NRC sets a completely different standard for an industrial site cleanup than they do for a site that is maybe residential or even recreational use. The amount of radiation allowed for an industrial site is 4 times higher than what would be allowed for a residential site. To those of you that are familiar with the terms, 25 millirem per year for residential sites according to the NRC, 100 or more millirem per year for an industrial site.
Is that based on 8 hours exposure?
Yeah, this is what I had in the previous slide there was one of the factors was time. Not only the time that it takes for radionuclides to decay, it's the time that you're exposed to them. go in the opposite direction. So, what we come to is this site, for the sake of good stewardship, for the sake of our fellowship with the whole biotic community, this site needs to be cleaned up to the highest achievable standards. Can't just run around it with a Geiger counter and say good enough. It has to be driven down to a level where you actually have to involve the laboratories. In Maine, our state has a counter to count radioactive emissions. And it's built out of scrap metal salvaged from pre-World War II battleships. Because everything else, everything post-war, was contaminated by fallout. And so you can't get a reasonable count. They put a sample in there, they turn on their detectors, and they leave it for 24 hours, 36 hours, 72 hours in some cases, in order to pick up that signal. You don't do that walking around the site with a Geiger counter. Which, if you're talking about the NRC's universal standard of 25 milligrams, you can. You can. It's a difference. So, here's what. In part because the material is so hard to detect. Alpha emitters like plutonium, americium, the rest, bury it under half an inch of soil, especially wet soil like today. You're not going to find it. You're not going to find it. It's one reason we do early decommissioning, by the way. The way that we find those hard to detect is by looking at the ones that are very active. Cobalt-60, for example, is the kind of stuff they use in medical equipment. You figure out what the percentages are likely to be of all of the radionuclides, and you measure the one that you can most easily measure, then you do a calculation to figure out what else is there. Anyway, they're hard to find. The only real safe way to deal with it is to clean it up as best you can, and then let time and nature heal the site. So, that's the project. I forget what we called it, the Vernon Restoration, something.
Hunt Farm?
No, it's not Hunt Meadow, because Hunt Meadow is another place. Anyway, the upshot of it is,
Hunt Farm?
the upshot of it is that the, oh, and also stupid, I forgot. Sorry about that. In terms of redeveloping the site, what we found at Maine Yankee, at Connecticut Yankee, at Yankee Road, is you cannot redevelop the site, the industrial part of the site, as long as the spent fuel is there. There are security reasons for that. In Maine, we proposed part of the site, somebody did, for a regional detention facility. Hey, you know. So our less worthy citizens could get parked out there. But on investigation, the liabilities, the legal liabilities, were so high that the whole idea was scrubbed. Redeveloping the site is a dream, and it's a bad dream. No. Here you have, remember that first slide? Connecticut River? Here you have in each of the states down through, Vermont, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Massachusetts, you know, the whole run, all the way down to the Long Island Sound. You have people putting in nature trails, canoe paddling, courses, nature preserves, because we as a society are just now beginning to realize that these rivers are a precious resource for something other than industrial use, for our soul, for taking care of the nature that will, in turn, we hope, take care of us. And so, what I'm suggesting is that the Vernon site be dedicated as a nature preserve, that public access be, if it's cleaned up enough, be allowed but limited. As Ned mentioned, you cut down the hours of exposure, so daytime hours. Let's take the societies that hike the Connecticut River banks, but have to cross over to the Hinsdale side when they get to Vernon Dam. Let's bring them on through. Anyway, that's my pitch.
Thank you, Ray.
Let me just say, by the way, this isn't going to happen by itself. One of the really joyful, happy episodes in my adventures with the nuclear industry is confronting them, and confronting them on their own turf, in a most civil way, of course. But no, they need that living community of biota that inhabits that site and the area around needs advocates. They need people that care enough about it, and that see things in larger and longer time frames to speak up. So anyway, that's my pitch to you, and I'm glad that you have the patience to sit there and put up with it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ray, very much. Is this on? We'll take a couple-minute break and then reconvene with Maggie. Maggie Gunderson, tell us all about tritium.
So I was a rookie in nuclear stuff, or just an avid volunteer. And Arnie was one of those people that I could call and ask a question and get a serious answer. And that was invaluable early on. I doubt I would have stayed as involved as I have if I didn't have people that gave me answers. Chiclet is like telling everyone, come on, Arnie's coming up next. Let's get it going. Let's get it going.
Come on, Chiclet, let's go.
Okay, we are ready. Arnie Gunderson, everyone, from Fairwinds Associates, Fairwinds Energy Education.
Thank you for the applause. I have to say though that what put us on the map at Fairwinds was the work we did back in '07 on decommissioning, and it was the political context that Maggie developed that made that report really resonate the way it did. And you know, the same thing then in 2009 when we were putting together the oversight panel. It was the political context that Maggie developed. So you know, you sort of applaud me as maybe a talking head, but in fact, the person who had the strategy and the media that made Fairwinds what it is Maggie, and you'll hear from her.
Okay. Arnie, you gotta move. You can't have the there. Okay.
Am I good here? Okay.
You had Gunderson right on your forehead. I thought it was pretty clever.
It said Arnie Gunderson right across your forehead.
Oh, it's coming over here. Okay, there's the projection.
Okay, go tell him. Listen, go tell him.
Am I good here? I want to go back a little bit before Ray and talk a little bit about what were the arguments that Entergy made when the Vermont Yankee was on the ropes. And there was two, you know, it was premature to close the facility. And the other one is that, oh my God, we're going to kill the polar bears because of all of the carbon dioxide that Vermont Yankee saved. Those were the two arguments. So let's look at the first one, which was this premature. It had a 40-year license and it got an extension. So it's hard to claim that something that ran for 44 years when they planned to run it for 40 was premature. But the next slide. But the other piece of that is the construction boom that started in '69. Vermont Yankee was one of the early power plants. And just ended this year, a plant that started construction in '72 just went online last week. Think about that. That construction boom was determined to be, this is Forbes magazine now, these are not anti-nuclear radicals here, this is mainstream management, the biggest industrial managerial disaster in the history of the world. So that construction boom never made economic sense. All of these plants were bailed out, sometimes 2 and 3 times. And lest we forget, they almost couldn't find a buyer for Vermont Yankee back in 2000. And it was the coalition's efforts that got as much money as they did. They paid about $190 million, and in return they got the power plant and a $300 million decommissioning fund for $190 million. So you couldn't give these things away. So to claim now, in 2014, that, oh, it's a valuable asset, to me that doesn't make sense. But the focus of this report is the other side of that. By shutting down my local nuke, I'm going to kill the polar bears. So next slide. Some really bright person back in 1960 started collecting carbon dioxide levels in Hawaii, a pretty pristine environment, at a place called Mauna Loa. And the Mauna Loa data is the gold standard for carbon dioxide buildup in the atmosphere. In 1960, when Mauna Loa data started collection, the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is about 310 parts per million. What that means is there's 310 molecules of carbon dioxide in 1 million molecules of air. Now, pre-industrial, back in 1600, 1500, that number was 280. So it had grown from 280 to 310 over 100 or 200 years. So this is the Mauna Loa data for the last 50 years. And last year, for the first time, it broke 400. And you've heard of 350.org. Well, James Hansen, a famous guy at NASA, has said that the world has to get back to 350 parts per million, or else we're going to have a global warming or a global climate change disaster. So 350.org took their name from Hansen's 350. So 350 occurs in the late 1980s. So we've been above Hansen's disaster level since sometime around 1987. Hansen, by the way, is now a pro-nuclear advocate, and I'll talk about him a little bit later. But this climate science is brilliant, but it talks about changing disciplines and how that's not necessarily a great idea. Okay, next slide. So related to that, oh, and one more thing about Mauna Loa. The ups and downs, this is winter, this is summer, winter, summer, winter, summer. So the plants pull the carbon out of the air, and then come September, when plants all die, it goes up again. So that's that little sawtooth.
Well, they don't die. They don't die. They go dormant.
When they go dormant and when they die, yes. Right. Okay, so this is the other piece of that. This is the amount of carbon dioxide that humans throw up into the atmosphere every year by burning fossil fuels. So there's more that gets thrown up into the air by burning forests in Brazil or Indonesia, but this is from burning fossil fuels. So when you take carbon from dead dinosaurs and pump it up into the atmosphere, you're adding to the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So right around 1960, this is as far back as I could find good data, humans were throwing up about 15 gigatons, and I'll talk about that term, per year of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Most of that at that time was the United States. A gigaton is 1,000 million tons. Now we would call that a billion in America, but the Japanese don't call it that, nor do the British. So the scientific term is a gigaton. It's 1,000 million tons. It's a lot of carbon. And so in 1970, we were throwing up about 15 or 16 gigatons of carbon dioxide. Now, we've doubled that. Humans are throwing up about 36,000 million tons, 36 gigatons of carbon dioxide. Okay, so there's 450 roughly nuclear power plants now. If we shut all of them down, not just for money, we shut them all down, and we replace them with, not solar, not conservation, but we replace them with natural gas, how much higher would that number go? Think about that for a minute. This is an audience participation round here. So this is Mauna Loa growing at 2 parts per million, roughly, every year. And this is carbon dioxide in the atmosphere growing at about 0.7 gigatons per year. Okay, next slide. So if we were to take this 36 gigatons and say, all right, we're going to shut the nukes down, we know we're going to take a carbon hit, how big a carbon hit are we going to take? And I'll give you an audience participation here. 1%, 50%, 100%, 200%. All right, who's voting for a 1% change? Couple. How about a 50% change? Couple. 100% change? Okay, so we're about evenly split between 1% and 50%. All right, next slide. Here's the answer. 3%. If all of the nuclear power plants in the world were shut down and we replaced that power with natural gas, we would increase the amount we're throwing up into the atmosphere by 3%. So, and that, by the way, is the World Nuclear Association number. Yeah?
Does that number take into account the mining of the uranium, or just once it's already mined?
No.
Repeat the question, please.
Yeah. Oh, the question was, does that number, does the contribution that nuclear's carbon contribution, is that in those numbers? And I guess it probably is, but it's a small, the carbon that a nuclear plant generates compared to the carbon that a coal plant generates is only about 5%. Mainly from the concrete curing when it's being built. So a lot of new building of nuclear power plants will actually crank a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere when they're being built. But anyway, if we...
She was asking about mining. Yeah, she asked, that didn't include...
Okay, yeah, but the mining is like 1% compared to coal, because coal has to be mined and trucked too. So still compared to coal, nuclear is much, much less carbon impact on the environment. So, but anyway, if we shut the nukes down, we'd see a 3% increase in the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And that's a World Nuclear Association number. That's not Sierra Club or Friends of the Earth. That's the nuclear industry itself is saying that's the impact of those 450 plants. Peanuts. So now let's take 450 plants, take that 3% and divide it by 450 plants to find out the individual plant's contribution. This is Vermont Yankee. Well, how much is Vermont Yankee's contribution to global warming? Next slide. It's 7 thousandths of 1% is what a nuclear plant, a single nuclear plant, when it gets shut down, contributes to global warming. if it were replaced by natural gas. And of course now we wouldn't do that. We replace it with wind or solar. But if you replace it with natural gas, it would only change the amount of carbon thrown up into the atmosphere by 7/1000ths of 1%. But yet here's Vermont Yankee convincing the state, oh my God, the polar bears are going to die. It's a drop in the bucket. It's less than a drop in the bucket. Okay, next slide. So now let's fast forward. The other thing that people were saying, I remember in the State House, is that, well, we have this nuclear plant down here in Vernon. We should shut it down, but we should build a new nuclear plant. Remember that? Yeah. That argument? And so let's look 35 years into the future and find out what impact building new nuclear plants would have on the environment. The World Nuclear Association wants to build 1,000 new nuclear plants between now and 2050. And these are two statements by people talking about how incredibly difficult it is. William Magwood was an NRC director and commissioner, and he talks about it. It's an incredibly difficult thing to build that many plants. James Hansen wants 3 times more. So let's take a look. Assuming we're going to build 1,000 new nuclear plants in the next 35 years, what the impact of carbon dioxide would be. Next slide. So first off, we got to remember, here's where we are today. About 36 gigatons. Even if the Paris Accords are implemented, carbon dioxide is going to go up. MIT estimates in the best case that in 2050, carbon dioxide is going to hit over 60 gigatons. So how can that be? If the world is implementing all of these carbon reduction goals, how can that be? And the reason is that people in India and China and Southeast Asia and Africa want to live like we do.
Yeah.
And you can't very well say, well, we're here, but screw you, you can't have the power that we're so used to. So there's a demand that's built into the system that we are going to be using more carbon dioxide before we turn that curve around. That was the best case from the MIT study. Some were 2 and 3 times higher than that. So even if we get out to 2050 and build 1,000 nukes, there's 1,000 nukes in this number,
Doesn't help.
the carbon dioxide we throw up into the atmosphere is almost double where we are today. Okay, next slide. Now with 1,000 nukes, if we didn't build those 1,000 nukes and we replaced it with natural gas, how bad would it be? 6%. It would be 6% worse if we didn't build 1,000. If you do that, 1,000 nukes is about 1 every other week between now and 2050, and there's none in the pipeline now. So 10 years out, you're talking about 1 every other day to meet that goal. So we're looking at if by building 1,000 nukes, we potentially could cut the carbon dioxide amount into the atmosphere by about 6%. So we're not talking about a game changer here, we're talking about a very small number. Now, if they were cheap, it still might be worth doing. Next slide. How much would it cost? $8 trillion. Now that's not a Friends of the Earth number either. That's from an investment bank called Lazard. I mean, these guys don't have a dog in this fight. That's their number. Investment bankers are saying you build 1,000 plants, you better expect to pay $8 trillion to mitigate 6% of the problem. Okay, next slide. So the other part of that is that over those 35 years, carbon dioxide buildup's not going to go on vacation and say, oh, I think I'll give humankind a break and sit back and let them catch up with these nuclear plants. It's going to be going up at roughly 2 ppm per year. 2 ppm times 35 years is somewhere around 70 ppm it's going to go up. While we're waiting for these nukes to tie their shoes and get to the starting line. Well, they will never be able to turn that curve around. 6%, $8 trillion, 35 years, and it doesn't even put a bend in the curve. Okay, next slide.
But it does matter who's getting that $8 trillion.
Oh, God, yeah. You just said it does matter who's getting that $8 trillion. That's right. You know, and so when you see, I'll talk about this slide in a minute. When you hear the nuclear advocates go to Congress, it's called Capitol Hill. And I wonder how they spell capital. You know, I mean, they're there for capital. That's what they really want. They're talking about let's build a wave reactor, and we'll have the first working prototype by 2030. Yes. Or let's build small modular reactors, and we'll have the first working prototype by 2030. Or thorium reactors. Or. We don't get the first of the kind for another 15 years. So we're investing in a prototype for 15 years. Meanwhile, there's a lot of other alternatives that are much, much cheaper. And that's really where this slide was taking us. This is the, there have been 46 nukes were built in the last 10 years.
Globally or the U.S.?
No, not in the U.S., worldwide. U.S. built 1 and shut down 5. 6 actually starting today. But 46 were built. The average time to build them was 10.6 years. So that's a pretty good average. 46 plants, 10 years a plant to build. This is a projection. I've got the source here, Renewable Energy World, shows that over the next 10 years, the U.S. now, this is a U.S. number, and I'm sorry, I keep bouncing from world to U.S., but the U.S. will increase nuclear by a drop in the bucket and increase wind and photovoltaic rooftop by huge amounts. And here's why. Next slide. Follow the money. And this is your question. So these are nuclear plants. These 4 up here are nuclear plants that are that we have estimates for. And of course, all the estimates always get blown on these are low. But people are estimating that the Turkey Point units in Florida will cost 17 cents a kilowatt as the power leaves the plant. That's not what you pay because you've got the transmission and distribution. We call that the bus bar cost. That's what they would charge the grid to send the power out, 17 cents. North Anna, 15 cents, Vogel, 14 cents, Hinkley Point, 12 or 13 cents. These are numbers we know. These plants have been pretty well engineered, and of course they're on the low side. So this is where nuclear is, at least 12 cents and as high as 17 cents. This is where solar is. These are contracts. These are power plants that have been built already. 2013, 14, 15, 15, 15, 16, 16. And in 2013, solar was charging 8 cents. Look where it is today, 3 cents.
It was actually 2.5 cents in the most recent contract in Chile.
This is contracted.
Yeah.
This isn't somebody's design wish. These are contracted numbers. Look at that trend. I mean, how can nuclear ever think it's going to close that gap? And the Chile is another one, but they're all now coming in. Now, the other interesting thing is, and that's what this line is, people say that to conserve, you save about 3 cents. So solar has actually gotten to the point where it's easier to spend your money building new solar than it is insulating your house.
Wow.
That's absolutely an amazing number. So, and of course the trend shows no sign of turning around either. Okay, next slide. So this is interesting. Here's another investment bank, Citibank. They don't have a dog in this fight either. And Citibank said, utilities could be winners, but they will have to transform with the times. Renewables, despite intermittencies, and that means, you know, when the sun doesn't shine and things like that. Renewables, despite intermittencies, could operate as smoothly as traditional fossil fuels. It's the kind of creative destruction that demands the fundamental changes of an entire sector. So Citibank is saying, utilities got to get on board. And what's happening here, I think 100 years from now, people will say, this wasn't about being pro-nuke or anti-nuke. This was about a battle between the 20th century paradigm of central station power and the 21st century paradigm of distributed power. People are getting their power back. We're able to use it on our rooftop and consume it directly into our houses. The utilities don't want that to happen because that money's skipping their processes. But what's happening here, and I think what Citibank is saying, is that there's creative destruction occurring. And you either get with the program or you're going to die. So utilities must change to a distributed model because the 20th century paradigm of the central station power is over. Next slide. So I've said, this is my quote from Forbes magazine, and I'll read it to you because I really like it, sorry. We all know the wind doesn't blow consistently and the sun doesn't shine every day. But the nuclear industry would have you believe that humankind is smart enough to develop techniques to store nuclear waste for 250,000 years. But at the same time, humankind is so dumb, we can't figure out a way to store solar electricity overnight. Okay, next slide. So we have a choice. And the moneyed interests of the world would like to store toxic waste forever, to build nuclear power plants for $8 trillion. But the alternative is we can store electricity overnight by going to a lower cost solar economy. So it's incumbent upon us to make our legislators aware of that. And in Vermont, I think we're pretty good already. If I was giving this talk in church, I'd probably be thrown out of the room already. But it starts and stops with Congress. And we can be a voice in stopping this in Congress. That we say, why are you investing money in a traveling wave reactor that may have the first prototype in 2030 when we can have a cheaper alternative out the door tomorrow? And when they start asking that question, we will be really in the 21st century. Next slide. And that's it. Thank you.
But Arnie, one thing you didn't mention is those Turkey Point reactors 6 and 7, by the time they're online, the plant is likely to be underwater.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
That is a 6,000-acre energy park on the southwest side of Biscayne Bay, across Biscayne Bay from Miami. Yeah, wow. South and west of Miami, actually just due east of Homestead. So when Andrew came ashore, they lost off-site power, so they had to collect diesel oil from the local area hospitals to keep those pumps running while grid was restored 3 weeks later. So they were close to a Fukushima at that twin reactor site. There's a bunch of oil sites, but 6,000 acres on the Florida coast, the average elevation is 2 feet above sea level. But they have the reactors built up on fill about 16 feet. But I mean, just imagine when the ice shelf disintegrates and worldwide ocean levels come up 5 meters overnight. You imagine them trying to defuel those spent fuel pools from some sort of barge? I mean, it's insanity. Anybody know anybody in Florida? They ain't gonna be there for long. All right.
You're already seeing that. Our daughter's a paramedic. Well, she was a paramedic in South Carolina. Now she's a nurse in Florida. In South Carolina, just when it's high tide, the entire downtown, there's areas that flood out and they can't even drive the rigs through to emergencies. and part of Florida is having that also already. So, in Miami.
Yeah. That's censored.
Thank you all for inviting me here today. I'm Maggie Gunderson, and I'm the founder of Fairwinds Energy Education. And I'm here today to share my perspective on the flawed myth of nuclear power. You've already heard Ray Shaddis talk today about the radiological cleanup of the main Yankee site. He faced a huge challenge to monitor and negotiate strict environmental standards with Entergy, who took over the decommissioning of main Yankee after it was permanently shut down in 1996. The reactor, which began operating in 1972, became too expensive to repair and had to shut down after finding that many parts were either defective or showing extreme wear. A buyer who could afford extensive repairs could not be found. Now, thanks to the heavy legislative lifting done by Ray Shaddis, his colleagues, and community neighbors, much of the Wiscasset seaside site is regaining its pristine beauty. And it's being touted as the prettiest seacoast town in Maine, making it a new tourist destination. When Maine Yankee was built, the people of Maine were promised the highly radioactive spent fuel would be removed every 3 to 5 years for reprocessing, just like its atomic neighbors, such as Vermont Yankee. Later, however, when reprocessing proved impossible technologically, atomic reactor community hosts, like Vermont Yankee and Maine Yankee, were fed a new story. Nuke neighbors and surrounding communities were promised that that toxic spent fuel would only remain until the site was completely decommissioned, and the fuel would be moved from its temporary storage, named interim storage by the federal regulators, to a permanent waste repository. Yet, today, more than 30 years after its shutdown and decommissioning, while Maine Yankee's buildings are gone, the spent atomic fuel, its highly radioactive waste, blights the site and remains a terrorist target. Moreover, with no final secure resting place for the reactor's toxic waste and no feasible technology available to host this waste forever, the people of Maine are left with a burden that must be protected for at least 250,000 years. Can you envision that amount of time? I can't, and frankly, no one can. And that too is what's facing Vermont Yankee and all of you. Arnie showed you why the flawed myth of nuclear power is very much a part of the climate change problem. Spend money on new atomic power reactors, whether they are techies' dreamed non-reality of a thorium reactor or the so-called small modular nukes, both of which were designed and built back in the 1950s and 60s. All atomic reactors have several things in common: ever-escalating costs, no economies of scale, and they emit toxic radioactivity from the day they start operating until 250,000 years after they are shut down. We, in this presentation, we're not even looking at the carbon production and decimation of pristine lands from the front end of the fuel chain, uranium mining, to the back end of toxic leaking radioactive waste dumps like Savannah, Riverside, Hanford, and WIPP. 6 atomic reactors have recently shut down and begun the decommissioning process. Almost 20 of the 99 reactors remaining in the US are awaiting some form of life support, while politicians are scrambling to create an infusion of taxpayer subsidies to keep those reactors online. It is simple. Whether they are old or begging to be built, atomic power is not economically feasible. Not healthy for people living within 50 to 100 miles or more, and permanently lay waste to large swaths of our precious land, water, and even contaminate the very air that we breathe. When I worked as a spokesperson for the nuclear industry, I did not know these facts. Instead, I and others in my field were fed outright lies and the nuclear jargon called nuke speak. But these facts were known by some deep within the military-industrial complex. I've seen and reviewed a lot of the papers. And this was well before atomic power was planned or pushed forward via the 1953 Atoms for Peace program. The very radioactive data upon which the exposure risk levels that Ray talked to you about in his presentation are based around the entire world is false. The ICRP, International Council of Radiation Protection standard, was created using data after documents and medical records were hidden and destroyed. That withheld information detailed the true radioactive exposure risk of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. Our own US government vehemently denied the meltdown at 3 Mile Island and the significant plume of radioactivity that spread along the Susquehanna River Valley, contaminating land, food, and water for generations. The same thing happened at Chernobyl. Ray showed you slides from there, where 5 years of data proving the level of contamination was destroyed by the government of the USSR. Sheep and gardens in Wales are still contaminated, and people cannot eat the mushrooms or wild boar in sections of Germany due to the ongoing radioactive contamination from Chernobyl. Arnie has been to Japan 3 times to speak about the decimation of the Fukushima prefecture from ongoing devastation of the Fukushima Daiichi meltdowns. The Pacific Ocean is heavily contaminated off-site as radioactivity continues to spread far and wide via contaminated water table and the toxic dust blowing from woods and forests that were poisoned by the radioactive plume during the explosions and meltdown. Why does this matter to you individually and to all of us together? People tell me since Vermont Yankee is now shut down, there are no more worries. I truly wish that it was that easy. Right now, VY's spent fuel pool hosts the equivalent of 700 atomic bombs worth of radioactivity. For us, the alleged SAF store, pronounced like sap, leaking radioactivity remains, call it a carcass, if you will, on the banks of the Connecticut River for 60 years, so that Vermonters must eventually and belatedly clean it up. The financial timelines Fairwinds first brought to the attention of the Vermont legislature and the NRC in 2007 still apply. The way Entergy is using the decommissioning trust fund, built with ratepayer money, there will never be enough money to dismantle and clean up the site, especially after 60 years. Look at Fairwind's work, detailing the VY Trust Fund, or slush fund as we call it, on our website, fairwinds.org. And that is Fairwinds spelled with an E for energy. Remember when Arnie and I first alerted the legislature to those non-existent buried and underground pipes in 2009? Entergy called us liars on tape and in legislative hearings. Yet in January 2010, those non-existent buried and underground pipes leaked toxic tritium and other extremely radioactive isotopes onto the Vermont site. That tritium is still on site, and it'll continue leaking and migrating toward the Connecticut River and the nearby aquifer. Tritium, a radioactive isotope that crosses the placental barrier, damages organs and destroys cells, becomes tritiated water, and stays in the body for 18 months to 3 years. It moves as quickly as water as it migrates towards the Connecticut River and the nearby aquifer. It will contaminate water, land, and food. The industry claims it is only tritium, so it does no damage, a statement that has been scientifically, repeatedly proven false for more than 15 years. I am sure that all of you as Vermonters have walked along Vermont's rivers and streams and know that when they flow slowly, little is disturbed. But with rain or snowmelt, they flow swiftly, pushing anything in their path and pulling things in their wake. Behind the migrating tritium, there are more toxic and slower radioactive isotopes spreading toward the river and aquifer. Cobalt, cesium, a muscle seeker, and strontium, a bone seeker, also contaminate the VY site. And as Ray told you, there are many other radioactive isotopes there that haven't even been counted. Because the only isotopes measured so far are the 4 I mentioned in very limited tests conducted by Entergy. The site contamination is the most important reason that the buildings should be dismantled as soon as possible, so that the migration emanating from underneath the buildings and in Entergy's alleged non-existent buried and underground pipes can be stopped from reaching our precious waterways, the river and aquifer. What is the greenfield specified in the agreement between Entergy and the state of Vermont? How will the NRC enforce it? Is it even possible? Doubtful. With the type of intervention that Ray Shaddis and others pushed for in Wachusett, Maine, that's what you'll need. People locally and the government of Vermont must do the same here. Fairwinds is an educational nonprofit. The Fairwinds crew works with Arnie and I every day to speak truth, mostly to atomic power, so that people have the facts and know the truth. All I can tell you is don't be fooled by this nuke speak that's being sent your way. I was fooled early in my career. Now, when I'm finished, let's listen to Andy Burt and watch her film Down to Earth. This greater Brattleboro area of Vermont is a beautiful land. Pristine still at many of the local sites I've been lucky enough to visit. I was raised as a New England farm girl. I could settle here and feel close to this land. Yet every day I am mindful of the toxic plight here in Vermont that is seeping further and further out of control.
Thank you, Maggie, Arnie, Ray. And I'm reminded of how much more of an effect Michelle Obama was able to bring to the microphone the other night when she was talking about the fellow with the blonde toupee. When she got emotional, when the emotions break through into your talk, it touches a nerve and it shows that you're in this with us and we feel it, we get it, and that's important. So thank you for that. Wonderful talk. Yeah, I guess we could have a Q&A.
Sure. Yeah. Great idea.
Yeah. Take some pot shots. I mean, you want to ask?
As much as
I don't know what pot shots means. Somebody start us off with a question from the floor.
As far over to...
There you go, Sally.
All right.
And Arnie, come on.
I could ask this. of
I'll repeat
Gordon.
it for the tape.
Ray was talking about the contamination under the turbine building.
Yeah.
And the claim that because the turbine building was on top of it, there wasn't going to be water infiltrating and bleeding it off site. But since they shut down the plant, they've had the basement flooded with water. And they've been storing it in swimming pools, little blow-up swimming pools. Is that the turbine building, or is that a different building? And is that not happening in the turbine building as well?
Yeah, the press is not asking that question.
They don't ask.
It's too bad Baba that wasn't here or something. You know, yes, it's the turbine building that's leaking. Now, they're claiming that tritiated water outside the wall is coming in.
Yeah.
I don't know how that can happen. You know, the question people should be asking is, where did that tritium come from? And what else is in the water? And, you know, I know that the wall between the turbine building and, Ray talked about it, the AOG, the augmented off-gas building, that was contaminated not just with tritium, with cesium and strontium and cobalt and all that stuff. And I just have a really hard time believing that the only thing leaking into that turbine hall is tritium. They can ship tritium to Tennessee. They can't ship strontium to Tennessee.
Why?
Because the Tennessee license won't take it. So they said in their licensing submittals they were going to keep the radioactive waste system operating, and they could treat all this water like they had been for years and years, but they've chosen not to do that. And instead, the goal is to call it tritium and ship it to Tennessee.
Well, how did they?
The NRC uses the old standard for tritium. When they first licensed the plant, they thought that tritium passed through the body just like water and did no damage. And they also alleged that it only stayed in the body for about 50 days. Now, for more than 15 years, there's been verified scientific data that shows the tritium actually changes into tritiated water and attacks every cell and crosses the placental barrier and does these other things. But the NRC and federal, you know, any branch of the federal government, Department of Energy also, is allowing the old tritiated water standard and the old tritium standard to stand. And they're letting the whole industry get away with this.
Right. And meanwhile, they're upping the background levels.
Yeah.
Right.
The other thing Maggie said in her talk was that I just got back from an industry conference on decommissioning down in North Carolina. And I was the only one that represented the NGOs. And there were 400 of them and me. So the odds were pretty good for me. But anyway, they all said the best thing to do is to immediately dismantle the plant. And they all said the SAP store, there's nothing in it about protecting the poor workers. That's what the NRC told Peter Welsh in a letter about 6 months ago. You know, Peter questioned it and they wrote back, we need those 60 years to protect the poor workers. But everybody in that conference said it's about the money. It allows the funds to grow.
Right.
But if they had to collect it at the beginning, like if it was a windmill, you've got to have all the decommissioning funds in place when you turn the windmill on. If they had to collect it at the beginning, they couldn't run the nuclear power plants because they'd be too expensive. So this is another one of those subsidies from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that they underfund the decommissioning and then allow the fund to grow in the market. But getting, especially, and I said it in our report, and I looked the NRC in the eye and I said, get that AOG building out of there. It would provide work for people in Brattleboro, and it would eliminate the source of that migration to the river. And the NRC didn't even look at it.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, as Ray said, they're dumping sludge from the cooling towers and sand and gravel that's radioactively contaminated right next to the river where the cooling towers are located. Then every time it rains or we have one of those huge monsoons that we seem to get more and more frequently now, that stuff is able to run over land, not migrate through soil, which they claim happens more slowly with radioisotopes. It just flows overland right into the river, and there seems to be no regulation. It doesn't fall within the NPDES permits that only looks at the drains.
Yeah.
Only one of the 11 of which is even monitored for radioactivity. It's crazy. It's crazy.
Yeah, there's a question, I don't know if there's an answer to that, but yes, you're right, it's crazy. And, you know,
The regulations miss the problem.
the NRC views decommissioning entirely differently than the public does. You know, they have this little tiny box, but in fact, we view it as a much bigger issue. You know, there's no reason why the decommissioning fund couldn't have built in enough money so that the town, when it's left in a lurch, has enough money to pay its taxes for 5 or 10 years to make an orderly transition. Or that there'd be enough money in the fund to pay the workers for a period of time. But the issue there about adequately funding the decommissioning funds, if you do that, nuclear is not competitive. Yeah. Yeah.
Why can't our EPA step in there, or the state?
You know, in decommissioning regulation, the NRC actually says, the only thing we're interested in is dismantling that plant. If you want to add more in, you can. It's actually, they've actually repeatedly said that, but it's not our problem. So, you know, utilities, especially utilities, not the investor-owned utilities like Vermont Yankee used to be, could demand more in the fund than the NRC has in the fund. The only thing the NRC is concerned is that little box about making sure eventually that carcass is gone. But we, or citizens in other states that still have operating plants, could say, we want a tenth of a penny more in our electric rates so that the town down the road doesn't get decimated when the nuclear plant leaves.
And that's where Ray took the lead in Wisconsin. You know, you have to push the legislator. That's something for all of you to do. That's something none of us who aren't in this, you know, we don't live in this area. It's not something that we can do. It's not something professionally that we can do as an education organization or as expert witnesses. But it's up to you to mount the kind of citizens' action that you mounted to walk to the State House that Robbie Lepser has talked about in his film that he directed about power struggle. It's a power struggle now, even more importantly that the plant is closed.
Let me say two things. But two other things on that issue. You know, the Maine Yankee and Connecticut Yankee were investor-owned. And essentially the ratepayers were part of that deal. So when Maine Yankee went to shut down and didn't want to wait 60 years, the ratepayers picked up an increase in their rates so that it could be dismantled quicker. When Connecticut Yankee found strontium-90 in the water table, there was a half a $500 million bill that they hadn't anticipated in the decommissioning charges, and everybody in Connecticut wound up paying that extra $500 million over 10 years in their rates. Vermont Yankee's not like that. It's a private company. It's gone. So we have two different worlds out there. We have these limited liability corporations like Vermont Yankee and 40 others. And then we have 60 that are utility owned. I actually think the NRC doesn't want towns to be compensated. I know the industry doesn't want towns to be compensated because when they shut a plant down, they have an ally in that town to lobby their politicians saying, oh no, please don't shut my plant down. Whereas if that town knew that it had a 10-year fund to make an orderly transition, the shock would not be as significant. It's another subsidy. Yes.
Skylar's in the back.
Oh, Skylar, yeah.
I was just wondering what the implications are and prospects are for this federal legislation to compensate plants that are still storing high-level waste. I mean, the whole premises of the waste confidence, what's communities possibly hosting new waste facilities is that they will be compensated for allowing those into our communities. And now, at present, there are most of 100 or more, actually, that have high-level waste that communities are not being compensated for. I know that Mark is sponsoring the legislation. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Restate the question, too.
Yeah, well, the question was, that there is a movement afoot in Congress to compensate a town that has an interim spent fuel storage installation. You know, like Maine Yankee. The site is clean, except it's got this thing with a fence around it with all the nuclear fuel. And until that moves, there's a movement in Congress that the town should be getting federal funds to offset the risk that it's taking. I don't. You want to talk on that? Or yeah. My thought is that it really depends who gets control of Congress, whether that is going to have legs or not.
You think the Democrats will be more?
Yeah, we can't make political statements.
Okay, you may just.
But,
Yeah.
okay.
Any other questions? And then we're
Yeah,
ready.
right here. Clay is ready here
Then
too.
Clay's ready to go
I
ahead.
just wonder if you know anything about our legislative members meeting with the NRC on what that's about. There's supposed to be some meeting.
Right, it's next week. There is a meeting next week, and part of it's open to the public, and you can get the call-in number and listen, and as typical NRC, a lot of it's a closed meeting. And then, of course, it's in the nuke speak and the jargon, and it's a shell game, you know? So we'll see how savvy the state officials participating are with it. That's the extent of my political comment.
No, there's one other piece to that. I got to know Greg Gaskell pretty well. Greg was the former head of the NRC, the chairman of the NRC, who was run out of the NRC by a coup of the other commissioners. Greg was the closest thing we'll ever see to somebody who cared about the public, and the other 4 commissioners were essentially representing the industry. And they basically made his life so miserable that he left. But Greg was telling me, we were speaking a lot in California together, and he's in the process of writing a book, and he was saying that the industry takes the elevator to the top floor of the NRC building and meets individually with the commissioners. That's not a public meeting, and it never gets on the record. Then what happens is the commissioner picks up the phone and calls the lowliest engineer in the organization saying, what the hell's going on with this problem? So from the industry gets right to the top of the industry of the NRC and is driving the lowliest person in the organization. And Greg was trying to change that. He was saying to these commissioners, what are you doing? We have a management structure here. But it was a vehicle for the nuclear industry to influence policy without ever being seen on the docket. And you have to remember all these commissioners were also appointed by Congress.
You're ready to hear Andy, and we will be around for a little bit after. And we and Ray can answer questions after that. Thank you.
In 1969, I think, and she and her husband had just done a tour working anti-war with the American Friends Service Committee. They came looking for a home somewhere, anywhere, in the town of Edgeman where we lived at the time. I just remember it was in a rainstorm, and I just remember her as being very young and very pregnant and looking for a home kind of thing after having given lots of years to the American Friends Service Committee. Andy was an active activist when we did the first Maine nuclear referendum in 1980. She served as secretary to Friends of the Coast, which we organized to deal with the Maine Yankee decommissioning in 1996. Has always been there. She and her husband and their kids did a off-the-grid, all solar, largely passively heated home and homestead. And so I just wanted you to kind of know who this person was a little bit, who's doing this narration. She's now decided to take up making the pitch for activists and activism.
Hello, I'm Andy Burt, a climate justice activist here in Maine and also a film producer. Thank you, friends at the New England Coalition on Nuclear Pollution, for inviting me and my film, Down to Earth, to join you for your annual meeting. I'm sorry that due to scheduling conflicts that I'm unable to be there with you in person as you discern your next steps to assure environmental oversight and safety at the closed Vermont Yankee plant and other nuclear facilities in our region. Your cause is dear to my heart. I live with solar power just 2 miles from the closed Maine Yankee power facility. Nearly 20 years ago, with your friend and mine, Ray Shaddis, as leader, I was part of a small band of local citizens, Friends of the Coast, opposing nuclear pollution. Together, we pushed Entergy to the wall and shut down the nuclear plant. Passion and humor fueled our creative challenge to Entergy at every turn. Today, I live with concern about the condition of the spent nuclear fuel that is stored at the Maine Yankee site. That backyard concern has pushed me to become actively engaged in a complementary cause, the climate justice movement. There I've found some of the same humor and passion and creativity that motivated and inspired me to participate in Friends of the Coast. Over the past 16 years, I've met and worked with several Maine climate justice activists of all ages and backgrounds. Their compelling experiences are begging to be shared publicly. Knowing that stories, yours and mine and our neighbors near and far, can change hearts and minds and inspire action, I set out to capture their stories on film, though I'd never done anything like that before. Thanks to their courage and willingness to share their personal stories, you will learn what motivated them to take risks and to struggle on behalf of the planet and future generations. Perhaps you will see your own story in theirs. I hope the Down to Earth film and its storytellers will provide you with a common platform around which you can discern your next action steps to address nuclear pollution in your backyard and beyond. Perhaps you will have new insights into your story that needs to be told to other communities that are facing failing nuclear plants. Together, our stories can change hearts and move us toward the nuclear and fossil fuel-free world we all imagine. I'm working in solidarity with you. Thank you.
Because creation is the self-giving gift of the Creator. The planet is sacred. And she writes, the ongoing destruction of life on Earth by human action, intended or not, has the character of a deep moral failure. So those are the kinds of things that I think about. I mean, the earth is our home. It is also a gift to us. It's been given to us to take care of. And so we're failing in doing that. And we need to listen up, do something about it.
16 years ago, I woke up to scientists' warnings that we had already signed up for changes in the climate that would dramatically impact the future my grandchildren would inherit. Holding my first grandchild, Kelsey, in the neonatal intensive care unit, where this 1.5 pound little girl was struggling to survive. You know, you could practically hold her in one hand. She was so tiny. I realized what she was facing in terms of what was happening to the earth, and I made that commitment to her in that moment that I would do anything to make sure that the earth was a place that would support her life and others. I whispered to her that I would do whatever I needed to. And that was the beginning of my climate justice journey. Along the way, I've led workshops on the science and moral challenge of climate disruption. I've created programs to motivate individuals and groups to adopt climate solutions, and I've engaged in nonviolent direct action where I felt it was necessary. Believing that how we live should reflect our values, my husband and I built an energy-efficient house powered by the sun long before it was popular to do so. Through these various experiences, I have met many Maine activists of all ages and backgrounds who have stepped up boldly to do something about the climate crisis. How did their journeys start? Who or what inspired them to become activists over time? Where do they find hope and courage, joy and passion to be part of this growing global movement for climate justice?
There's just something inside of me that just really pushes me and like inspires me to do these things.
I think, you know, that moment when I said I will start a group, it was like, you don't have a choice. There's these tar sands going to come to your little town and go down this creepy little pipe, and there isn't a choice because this is going to affect the outcome on the planet. This makes a difference. So it's always been that way with me. But it's not that I can do it. It's like if you do the next step, call the next person, it might work.
What gets people to take that next step? In this film, we will explore with a new generation of Maine activists what compelled them to take the next step. In my experience, the journey often starts with people's stories.
When people tell their stories, they bring it down to the level where you can tell about a small thing that may have big impact. Whereas what you read and what's out there is all about global this. It feels so big that what am I going to do?
With global problems, even small actions can have a big impact, as we will discover. And it's never too late to start. Becky Hallbrook is a good example.
This is kind of an unlikely story you're hearing here, because when I left Missouri, I went to graduate school in North Carolina and I came to live in New York City. I was working as a corporate lawyer. I worked in several different companies. At this point, it doesn't seem like it was a very wise decision because I worked for Texaco, After that, I worked in 2 chemical companies. I was very much on the corporate side. All the while, my heart was in the right place. You know, I wasn't anti-environmentalist, but I wasn't doing anything active about the environment.
I think the major inquiry was, how can I live my life in a way that's in alignment with my beliefs? And the sort of scary part was when I actually looked at what I believed, then the implications for what I would have to do with my life. And so it was wrestling with that, how that impacted how I lived in the world as a trans person, how I lived in the world as an anarchist, someone who doesn't believe in domination, wants to tear down the system, you know.
I got a call in the middle of the night from the police, and I needed to verify information, and I said, oh yes, that's my daughter, she got arrested. And I think they were probably surprised that I was supportive of her.
I think early on, as a young person, I had a lot of awareness of pain in the world, and that was we had a big vacancy in the way we structure ourselves in society. And I think I had some visceral emotional responses to just the painfulness of life in that way.
I remember being a kid in school and learning about the first wave of genocide on this continent and thinking about what I would have done at that time. My position as a white person, like this sort of my development of my understanding of in these larger structures was not totally developed, I feel. But as a kid, I feel like there's things that are so much clearer. There's not this bullshit that's like growing up of having to navigate and justify. It was very clear whose side I should be on. It was very clear what the right thing was to do. You know, it was just so clear. And so learning about the tar sands definitely was a very moment of like, oh my God, this is happening. It's the same thing. I'm now like in my mid-20s. It's so clearly so up. And it's so clearly an outgrowth of this continued genocide. It was like, okay, well, what are you gonna do about it?
Yesterday, I saw the activists who have suspended themselves from a bridge. I think it's in Portland, Oregon. I don't know if they're old people or young people, but I looked at it and I thought, I don't know if I could do that. Maybe I could. They've suspended themselves from the bridge long enough down so that this oil platform that Shell Oil has that's headed up to the Arctic to do drilling, so that ship cannot get by. Those people are my heroes. Will they ultimately keep Arctic drilling from happening? Well, I don't know the answer to that, but they're going to make people think. And maybe if I lived out in Oregon, I would be suspended from the bridge too. I think it would be great. It's a big statement they're making. And there were also protesters along the route of the Keystone who suspended themselves in trees and did some amazing work.
I'll just give a shout out to Skip and Sylvia because I know you've also interviewed them, but I consider them both also inspirations.
For many, many months, tar sands blockade and then also Great Plains tar sands resistance, which was the group we were part of in Oklahoma, did that form of activism as a way to call for the halting of this pipeline.
Sylvia Stormwalker told us what got her started.
So on my walk, I had this dream. I had a dream. Sometimes when I tell my story, it feels funny because, like, for me, it just totally makes sense, but telling, you know, people I don't know, like, this person, you know, but it just makes so much. I was literally walking, I was literally sleeping in the side of the road in a grove, and I had this dream. And I woke up crying, and it partly was this call to, if they start constructing the Keystone XL pipeline, that I was gonna go and put myself in the way. And then 3 days later, not making this up, my mom called me and said, you know, Sylvia, there's a group that there's gonna be a gathering and they're starting to construct it. And I don't know if you have this experience, but when something, I think I'm feeling more and more to listen to the shivers that come down my spine, or like the tears that come to my eyes. Like there's something about it that I know feels kind of true, and oftentimes it's hard because that truth sometimes does not mesh with sort of my day-to-day thing. It's kind of having to confront something that feels deeper. I was like, yeah, okay, Mom, that feels like a sign. So then I ended up hitchhiking out, went out to Texas, and got involved doing something I'd never done before, which was walking people to construction equipment, or people being high up in trees and tree sits, and this whole dance with authority figures where you say, if I don't oppose, an armed threat to you, you're not going to kill me. But if I stay up in this tree, the idea that we live in a system where the cops are not going to kill people outright if there's cameras, especially based on their racial identities if they're white, So there's this real interesting experience. And so this is where, for me, that experience of doing direct action and then meeting people who live there, that's been like so key to me, because it was scary. Down there, the corporation that was building the pipeline, TransCanada, had contracted to a private security firm similar to Blackwater. And then that firm in turn was hiring local police officers to be security guards to 24/7 guard people in this big blockade. So they had their uniforms, they had their weapons, they had their badges, but they were being paid by this corporation. So that's pretty scary. I mean, the collusion of state and corporate power to repress people. And I had, a number of friends. This was my first friends who were tased. I had a friend who had a heart condition, and it could have very easily been me, but she was multiple times tased with a taser, and really dangerous, and pepper sprayed, people put in chokeholds, dragged away. Just this real fear. That experience of fear and courage. So it also, that land there particularly was so powerful and welcoming to us. And that's actually where the name, so I wasn't born with the name Sylvia, and at the time I wasn't using the name Sylvia, but so Sylvia, I was feeling really scared and isolated about 9 months into this, and I was really looking for a name that felt like it would be an ally for me. And the only transgender activist in history that I knew of was this woman, Sylvia Rivera. And so it was this moment I needed a name, and I was like, okay, I'm Sylvia. Because of our blockade, we actually forced the pipeline route to be diverted, which is actually probably illegal, but they were putting so much pressure on the person who owned it that he didn't, fight it in court.
After a lot of time of resistance, it was completed, and it was turned on January 22nd of 2014, which was the day that we locked our necks to DD Bank. And so we both did that because we had both spent a lot of time in communities in that area, communities that have been fighting against this construction. And it was kind of a losing day. It was really sad overall. One, because this pipeline, which is named the Gulf Coast Project, is the southern leg of the Keystone XL pipeline. So when the Keystone pipeline was put on a hold because it had to go through the State Department, the company TransCanada, who put forth that pipeline, decided to expedite the southern leg of it, which they didn't need federal permission to move forth with. And so they expedited it through Texas and Oklahoma. Obama flew to the pipe yard and gave his blessing to this construction. And basically those communities were treated as a sacrifice zone, and they've been treated like that for a long time, especially in the petrochemical, petroleum, oil industry. So for us, it was a way to just tell the communities that we were part of that they weren't forgotten, and it was important that we did something to hit somebody somewhere where it could even hurt this much who was responsible.
I think the way in which being young and being described as the passion and the anger being sort of, oh, that's a phase, that's sort of a phase as you'll kind of adjust to society. and that pissed me off. Of course, I'm a kid. But meeting old people who are still pissed off, I mean, who are raising hell and who are like haven't adjusted to this terrible, system. It was like, okay, I'm not crazy. Well, I am crazy, but we're crazy together.
Some elders have been activists for decades, while others are just getting started. I met some new activists when I went to Washington, D.C. in 2011 to protest the Keystone XL pipeline.
I knew that this was something that was calling me. But when I got the email from McKibben, I thought, that's really too radical for me. But I had, our son Whit was living in D.C., so I decided that it was compelling enough that I would go down there and check it out.
So I did a lot of research and I was like, well, I can go. I'm not working and I don't have kids at home. And so I decided that I was going to go. And I didn't realize that the whole intent was to get arrested. So I was kind of talking this over with my daughter from Philadelphia, and I'm like, well, I don't know, maybe, you think I might get arrested? And she's like, Mom, the whole point is you're going to get arrested. I'm like, oh, I'm going to get arrested. So then I had to rethink again if that's something that I thought I would be able to do. So I got on this bus and I went to DC, and I was going to stay overnight in the church, and I was pretty scared and pretty nervous.
I went to the Lafayette Park and watched it one day. It was in progress. I think it had been going for 4 or 5 days. And every day it was the same. A very nice training the night before, a required training, and then a very solemn, respectful, but adamant statement being made by each of the people who were sitting in. And I watched it, and I was really impressed. So that night I went to the training. Again, it was not something that I was sure I was going to do. But the people that I met at the training and the way the training was conducted, in such a way to make everyone feel completely comfortable about what we were up to and why we were there.
So it was kind of my first time being arrested for anything, but when I actually was sitting there doing it, I had such a feeling of, I'm doing this for all these people who can't be here today, and I had a really sense of purpose, and it was just a really awesome, peaceful feeling.
That was really a turning point in my life. I came home and I thought about it, and I thought, did you really do that? Because it was not in my ordinary life story before.
We found that activism became a part of people's stories in many different ways.
I was living out in California in 1998, and I used to go to this place called the Bolsa Chica Wetlands in Huntington Beach. It was surrounded by oil pumps, and there were oil slicks all over the water. It was a really polluted mess of a place, but there was still life there. I would go there and watch white Arctic pelicans doing synchronized diving and swimming. Another day I might go there and watch thousands of jellyfish filling this wetlands. But my best friends there were a pair of great horned owls. So that was the beginning of my foray into environmentalism. I wanted to protect this place where I went. I wanted to protect these friends that I had made in this place, and that was how it began.
You know, everyone comes at activism from their own place, and I think that there's a huge
trend in the climate movement to focus more on social justice and the real faces and people who are being impacted by climate change, and of course I agree with that. That's not the main thing that motivates me though. In 100 years, this land is going to have been changed because of the way that humans have lived on planet Earth, and that's not right. So if I can do anything to mitigate the changes in this land, then I will.
There's lots of things that can make changes. I mean, if I think of Africa, the women farming is making a big difference. Western farming being implemented across the globe is doing so much harm. So much harm. It's damaging so much of the earth. You know, people can do it better. Also in India, they could do it better. So what I think is happening is that there's this ferment going on throughout the globe of people doing stuff. And I'm finding more and more that everything fits together. The other day I was sitting with a friend and I said, you know, at the moment it's like you have a pond, you throw in some stones, each one of them has a circle, and now the circles are beginning to touch.
I feel like you can't just ignore the injustice, you have to do something. And so I'm always struggling with, well, what could we actually do? Like, I'm not going to get everybody to give up burning fossil fuel, but what if we could do that in my house and really work people through, like, how do you do it? It's not impossible, it's not, you know, unaffordable, it's just a choice. Like, you can do it, and I can go tell people that, but even better would be if I just showed people, if I just figured it out and did it. And that's really what I try to be, is more not an activist, but a practivist.
I think the other thing that happened is that we bought this house. We definitely wanted something in town so that we could walk everywhere we wanted to go, but it was sort of our chance to make decisions moving forward because so much had to be replaced. I mean, we were basically fixing up, and it was definitely a fixer-upper. It still is. But we could sort of make those decisions on a case-by-case basis. Okay, let's research these heating systems, like what really is best, and if we did want to go solar eventually, what could we do now that would be, you know, compatible with that down the road?
Fred and Hadley Horsch gave us a tour of their in-town home, showing us some of the many choices that they have made to live more sustainably, including solar electric and solar hot water.
In some ways, you actually get a better return on your investment with solar electric, because every bit of that energy I can either use myself or I can share it immediately with everybody around me, and that just happens because I'm on the grid. And so if my house has extra energy to send, it can actually send it back over those wires and everyone else around me. So in a way, I've built a power plant here in the middle of Brunswick, and I'm supplying my neighborhood with power. The downside is that the way they've written the laws is I don't get paid for that extra power. It's sort of like if you're playing rugby, you'll never get a great baseball game. And that's what we're doing. We're playing this game where even if you play that game beautifully and perfectly, it's never going to solve the problem that we have. We have a problem that can't be solved by the political game we're playing right now, and so you have to change the rules of the game. I ran for office in part because people kept telling me, well, it's fine if I do this, but what about everyone else? And I'm like, you're right, we have to change the law. The law is really asinine right now. It's rewarding people who are doing the wrong thing, and then they can pay people to be in office to keep doing the wrong thing. And so we really do have to fix the political system. I love to not be in politics because I'm not good at it, but I think it does need to be done.
There are systems of money and power that have to be confronted and exposed in order to really understand the roots of the climate crisis. At the beginning of my sophomore year of college, I co-founded Divest Harvard. And we literally started with 3 people. There were 2 other co-founders, but we launched a campaign and we built it for 3 years. There's so many angles with which you can approach divestment. There's the financial angle, moral, political, social justice, and it's that kind of diversity that allows so many people to engage with the movement.
Look what happened in South Africa. I mean, that was a miracle what happened in South Africa, really. All my young adulthood and early middle age, I was waiting for some kind of horrible, bloody rebellion in South Africa. Waiting, expecting it, knowing it was going to happen. And it didn't. So the seeds were there when I saw what kind of influence money has.
I also see divestment as creating that crucial choice point that all stories have. Are we going to continue to invest in an industry that takes over our political system, that threatens our futures, that destroys communities all over the world today? Or will we refuse to condone that business model, and will we invest in climate solutions? By the end of our first semester, we organized a referendum vote on campus. It was the first vote on fossil fuel divestment in the world, and 72% of Harvard College students supported divestment. And that news spread like wildfire. It was unbelievable. Like every article ended up mentioning the 72% number, and it became like this epic myth on campus that all of these students are calling for divestment, yet our administration remains totally intransigent. So for 3 years, we kind of built up that narrative, and we built student power, alumni power, faculty power, community power. We ended up having a campaign where over 70,000 people were signing on, calling Harvard to divest from fossil fuels. And our administration remained totally against it, rebuffing all of our arguments, ostracizing student activism, punishing us. But the amazing thing about Divest Harvard is that despite the intransigence of our administration and the deep-seated mindset of the status quo that we confronted, our movement was huge and powerful and beautiful, and we showed how you can organize in a setting where there is very little hope that you will actually win, but that the fight exposes the true purpose of our work. You know, that you don't actually have to divest from fossil fuels in order to show that the fossil fuel industry is corrupt or that the Harvard Corporation is corrupt.
You know, it's not the wheels of God that grind slowly, it's the wheels of these institutions that we have. And it's not that they're bad people, it's the nature of institutions. They have to consult everybody. You know, and they don't consult the people, they consult all the people who have a vested interest. But that's how things work. And human beings need to learn that if you really want to make a change, you have to nudge that group of people to move and to lend their voices. And I think that's what Francis is saying. He was nudged. He lived in Buenos Aires in Argentina at a time which was horrendous. People disappeared all the time. The poor got poorer and the rich got richer. And he had a lot of priests under him who were beating the drum and pushing, and he heard it. And there will be others. I'm sure there will be others. But it takes a long time. You get very comfortable when you live in a palace.
I actually, in West Virginia, had a roommate for a short time. She was a flower child, and she said, you know, the revolution is coming. And I said, I don't think so, but I'm glad you're saying that, you know. That seemed naive to me. But it was interesting to me that anyone was interested in change, and that she came from some other place where that was possible.
The community where Rachel grew up had strong ideals, but it was resistant to change and was a hard place for a young woman to grow up. At the same time, her farm life there played an important role in her development as an activist for peace and justice concerns.
I go back in my mind to the farm. I go across all the fields, and I remember it. As kids, the farm protected us. Bad things happened to us in the community, but the farm was there. When I was still in the community, I was lucky enough to go for one day on the Aldermaston March, and it was wonderful. It was the first march I was ever on, and from my point of view, I felt as though I'd died and gone to heaven. It was wonderful. I was amazed at the variety of people that could do something together. You see, in the community, people were uniform in their thinking and their values, at least it seemed like that. Both my sisters had left, They're younger than me, but they both had left. So the fact that they were in what we call the outside world made a big difference, you know, because it takes some courage to leave there because you don't have anything. I really like the activism. So one of the reasons I left was I wanted to be an active person. I wanted in some way to contribute.
Chloe and MJ's activism was shaped by memorable experiences in childhood.
When I was little, my brother, my dad, and I go up to Maine's North Woods every winter for a few weeks to go snowmobiling. You know, we go up all these mountains that you could only get up on a snowmobile. And I totally fell in love with Maine.
We spent all of our summers in the country at a summer cottage that we had that my father had built himself. And we spent summers there because of the polio epidemics, and my mother, who was a nurse, made sure that we were not in the city where we would go to movies or to swimming places or things like that. But we had a rich, rich life by a lake, in the woods, just playing around. And so I became very conscious of and connected with the natural world.
And then I learned that there was this massive development proposal for Maine's North Woods, that Plum Creek, a huge real estate developer, was going to come in and build house lots and marinas and golf courses and helipads and turn this beautiful wilderness into a cheesy tourist attraction without any kind of real economic sustainability for the area. So I remember being on top of a mountain and looking at Moosehead Lake and all of the woods when I was 12 years old and thinking that I couldn't let that happen. I wrote letters to the editor of every newspaper in Maine. I testified at public hearings. I just dove into it and did whatever I could because that's what I cared about.
Some of the first political activism I actually did was solidarity work with immigrant justice activism in New York City, and undocumented youth were organizing for access to education around the DREAM Act. One thing that happened while I was in New York is Occupy Wall Street happened, and I was there during that period and really active within that space, and that connected me to activists all over the country. I basically just went all over to connect to movements that somehow I had become connected to. So one thing was youth organizing in Tucson whose Mexican American studies got banned by the state of Arizona. And while in Arizona, I also went out to Black Mesa, and Black Mesa is a section of the Dene Reservation where many, many families, 10,000 Navajo people, were forcibly relocated in the 70s due to Peabody coal mine. A huge percentage of mining in this country happens on native land, and so much water is poisoned, and it's people that don't have access to other forms of water. The families that I've stayed with at Black Mesa have to drive an hour to fill up 50-gallon buckets to haul all their water in, and they're close to 80 years old. That was the way I became involved in climate justice, was caring a lot about people. There are some people in the climate justice movement who are originally more drawn to thinking of the suffering of the earth, which is obviously hugely, hugely important, and I feel connected to now, but originally it was definitely thinking about people suffering.
The justice issues around land sovereignty and land and water resources are playing out here in Maine as well.
You know, history has shown us time and time again that Penobscot people have given too much all along. You know, we were once the people of this territory, and now we're living on a mere fragment of our ancestral homelands. And we love this river. We still practice our sustenance culture, and we need clean water.
I grew up here actually in Brewer, just about a mile away from here. And I always wanted to come down to the river. Anytime I went over that bridge or the one further down, I felt this pull of the river. And throughout my whole childhood, I never once touched that river. My parents, my foster parents, told me that it was too polluted, that if I touched the water, I would get sick.
You know, Native peoples have been saying forever that we are all just one, and it's with the water that is possible, because all the water that is all the water that is. You know, we share it all, we've shared it all forever. I was so blessed to be approached by a woman from Orono who had just recently learned that Orono was one of the towns that had entered into this court case as interveners. The sitting town council didn't even know that they were in a court case against the Penobscot Nation. And eventually, after a couple of meetings and a couple of go-arounds and understandings, they voted to withdraw. It is the water that brings us all together. We're all coalescing around this water. And this isn't anymore a tribal state issue. This isn't a tribal government, state government issue. It's not an Indian white issue. This is water, and water is life.
The water issues are front and center on a huge scale in Alberta, Canada, where tar sands oil is being mined and poisoning the sacred lands and waters of First Nations. Hilary Clark was one of several Mainers who traveled to Alberta in the summer of 2014 to participate in a healing walk organized by Indigenous leaders. It was a life-changing experience for her.
When I was 19, my father organized a canoe trip up the Yukon River. And that was just a really wonderful experience for me. And as I was talking about going to northern Alberta, I kept thinking about the Yukon, and I kept thinking about that experience that I'd had of just being up in this wilderness. So even though I knew I was going to where the tar sands were being extracted, that's what I kept thinking about, was this just glorious time that I had had. And so there was a part of me that just kind of expected to be able to touch that again, going up to Alberta. And getting up there and realizing that everything had been poisoned. And I was very aware that I was going into somebody else's space, the First Nation space. I was very aware that there was a culture that I didn't know, and I wanted to be respectful, but I didn't know what that was, how one is respectful. And then to have people stand on stage crying and talking about what was happening to their community and what was happening to people that they loved, and how their kids were sick and people were dying and people were having cancers.
It's an abusive use of economic power. To me, that is a terrible injustice. So I think of justice in that way. And I can't travel to every part of the world where all of this is happening. If I can stop them bringing that stuff here, I've stopped it moving, and hopefully it will go back down that pipeline and all the way out to Fort McMurray. Like everybody in this movement, we're dependent on somebody else along the line to carry out the little bit that we're able to do.
You talked about the power of stories. Like, I'll never forget those people's stories. And I'll never forget their faces.
Hilary told us about the first time she heard a tar sands story when she was attending a protest of the Keystone XL pipeline in Washington, D.C.
What mattered to me, what she said, was that she would lay down her life for this. And again, I thought, well, if she can do that, I can get up and speak in front of people, even if it gives me stomach aches or headaches or sleepless nights or whatever it is. The walk was hot, it was hard, it was horrifying. We started in green and we walked into this desert. I mean, I was thinking afterwards, I don't think I saw a bug in the road. I don't think there was any sign of life other than the people trudging through. And I saw the First Nations women doing the water ceremony. And it was so hard for me not to feel how futile that felt. Like, how is that going to help this? How could praying for the water, how is that going to change anything? And I had to really search to find the place that saw it as that ceremony was really the seed of my intention. Was that wasn't what was going to do it, but that was what was going to grow inside of me to work to address this. And that's what I needed to bring back when I came home, was that intention to do something about it. And what could I do? And what could I do is I could go beyond my comfort zone and start sharing my story with people. And it's, you know, it's like this path laid out before me. Speaking at an activist trial, and then sharing it with my congregation, and then sharing it with a school and with a church, and now sharing it with full congregations, with a sermon in different congregations.
I know that we've talked about this a lot, about sort of not depressing people and not focusing on the negative side of things too much, because boy, you can just go down a spiral. If you really, you know, pursue the trend lines out, we're destroying the place. Like, we're destroying the planet, and it's going to be uninhabitable. So how do you manage that?
I think it could be relatively easy to fall into despair. But I'm not going to.
What kind of things can we do that, for me, it sort of satisfies my need to do something that I think is reasonable and prudent, and not so burdensome that it's like, this is just no fun. So aquaponics is like another, I'm very into these projects, and they always start out how it's like some crazy idea, and some of them are crazy and we find that out, but others, you know, we actually, electric cars, one of them.
We've been on the bleeding edge of a few different technologies.
Like the electric car, when we first got it, I was like, is this going to work? I had no idea it was actually going to work. And it actually worked way better than, come on, you like driving it most of the time.
Oh, it's super fun to drive. You just really can't get to and from Portland in the winter on a single charge. Yeah, so that
the technology is getting better.
And as your only car, it's a little frustrating. Right. But it will get nothing but better. That's right.
But I was prepared for it really not to work. I mean, we didn't know. And so I'm willing to risk more than Hadley.
You apparently keep some things secret, too. You did not tell me it was not going to work. You were full of confidence that this was going to be a great solution.
I mean, all these things in theory are going to work, and then you do them and like, well, that didn't work out too well.
If I am going to err, I always want to err on the side of love. Not that I'm always there, but it seems to me that a person can never love too much. And really, all of justice comes down to loving other people, loving the world, loving our children. My spiritual experience that I had when I was in high school was this tremendous, overpowering feeling of being loved by God, and that I never doubt that. And I know that a lot of people do doubt that, but it seems like that is where my strength comes from.
You know, my basic commitment is to be what we call a contemplative in action. So I pray a lot. And I feel that much of what I do is a prayer in action.
There's a way in which I really feel like I felt the trees, like when they fell and impacted the ground, the vibrations. I was also up in a tree. And in a way I don't often articulate to people, because in a way it feels really sacred, and also it's like putting words to something I'm not sure is true, but in a way that really feels like the spirit of those trees somehow gave me courage to be there and like have entered me.
so my spirituality comes from life, all life around me, but I'm able to touch it through kind of some of the Buddhist practices, primarily for meditation and just my belief in impermanence and non-duality, that those fit with what my understanding from my earliest understandings. But then the UU Church in Portsmouth gave me a community. And as I really allowed myself to think and learn about the implications of what we've done to our earth and our planet and to life, I needed a support, and I found that at the UU Church.
The biggest thing I've learned is from Maria, and that is to make sure that people have a sense of hope, which is very important. The lists are endless, it really is, and we're up against forces that have money to pay for lawyers and lobbyists, and all we have is this grassroots. But in truth, the grassroots is more powerful, I think. We're doing it with heart.
I mean, I think that's a huge part of what political struggle is about, is people who are in vulnerable space are claiming that space as powerful. I think a lot of the more sacred space that I need to share collectively with people, it comes from that space in us that's really vulnerable.
Getting off the couch and doing something feeds me, feeds my spirit. I know a lot of people talk about being down in the dumps about climate change, and I just have never felt that.
I have friends in the activist world who say, oh, well, the battle's not over yet, every time there's a victory. And I celebrate every small victory along the way because, you know, we have to.
And so I think it's really important that we dig down to our deepest depths to really understand why we do this work, because that's how we integrate it into our identity. If what you love is threatened, you will never give up. You will never feel like you can stop. And I think people whose lives are directly threatened by the fossil fuel industry and by climate change feel that kind of urgency. I mean, the scary thing and the beautiful thing about climate change is that we all have to understand that that urgency exists for all of us in different ways and in different magnitudes and on different scales, but everything that we love is threatened. And I think that love has to be the core of why we do this work.
And actually it's the only good way of living with yourself because it makes you feel good. That was a very interesting thing, that a lot of the people who joined in Protect South Portland, they said they were happy. They said, oh, at last something I can do. And what they could do varied so much. For some it was a lot, and some it was difficult, and for some it was just being themselves. MJ and I were the welcomers. And we said to Taryn, yeah, but we're just sitting here doing the welcoming. And I would sign the little name tag. So everybody, once they had this name tag on, they were part of the group. So that became an important symbolic thing. And also another thing I would do is say, look, over there is the trainer. So if you just wait in that corner over there, you'll get thoroughly trained. Then you go over here and you'll get your package. And so from coming into a room and not knowing what to do and being overwhelmed and feeling shy, they then knew that they were part of the group and this is what they needed to do, this is where they needed to be. And I think that helped.
The issue in the South Portland campaign was preventing the Portland pipeline from reversing the flow from Montreal. This would bring Alberta tar sands into the Casco Bay community.
South Portland was in the position of being the only person, the only city, town, whatever, village along the way that could put a plug in that pipeline. And so it was a no-brainer. You could rally people to that because they could see it, and it was right near home.
I grew up in South Portland, and my grandmother grew up in South Portland as well. She remembers when they first put in the oil tanks around the field, and going to Kaler myself, like I know those oil tanks, and I remember being on the playground around those oil tanks, and so for her to like remember when they were first put in, and she remembers just how much like the air quality had changed.
So it has to feel personal somehow and manageable.
In March 2013, the first City Council workshop was held.
Between us and the two community organizations, or three, we got 400 people to that workshop. So it was a miracle moment.
I remember going to council meetings, and these were held at the rec center, which is like a huge space, and these seats were like filled.
Then 50 people from that audience lined up to speak. They had no talking points. Nobody had worked with them. They just said what they felt. And it was amazing. The whole thing was, and everybody said something different, but it all fit together. We quickly had a meeting with Environment Maine. They called some of their main backers, lawyers and so on, who warned us, said, you're getting in too deep, this is going to be too hard. We said, this is the only way.
This group coalesced in a very disciplined way. I've never worked with such a disciplined group, ever, even nuns.
So Natalie pulled together the first ordinance. She reckoned we had 11 days to get the 900 plus signatures we needed. In 11 days we got 3,775 signatures.
After an exhausting neighbor-to-neighbor campaign to pass the Waterfront Protection Ordinance, the election was held on November 5th. The ordinance was defeated by just 192 votes. Though they were outspent 10-1, organizers drew strength from their efforts, even with the loss.
That was something I hadn't quite experienced either before, like just sort of this defeat. But now I realize it was really just an opportunity to grow and to really work within like this, local political system to like rework the ordinance.
Going door to door in all 5 of the jurisdictions in the city, talking to people, brought about what I would call a sort of mass educational event that took place over a period of about 2.5 months. What happened then was that the city council began to hear from a lot of these people that they did not want tar sands coming through this city, but that they were fearful of the threat to jobs in the ordinance. They made that distinction. In spite of everything that they were being bombarded with, all kinds of fancy brochures, and I mean, that money went into a lot of advertising. And so the city council, by that token, got educated also. One of the city councilors had the wisdom, whatever, the chutzpah, to gather the council together the day after the victorious vote, where the pipeline won by 190 votes, and as said, we want to declare a moratorium because we want to find out how we can keep tar sands out of this city legally and without damaging the job structure in the city.
Sort of up until that point, I hadn't really felt so strongly that there was a community in South Portland.
Continuing to listen to the people of South Portland, the City Council ordered a transparent process to draft a new Clear Skies ordinance. The ordinance would ban loading crude oil onto tankers on the community's waterfront, in effect blocking the reversal of the pipeline. 7 months later, Portland Pipeline filed a lawsuit claiming that the ordinance was unconstitutional. The City Council asked the federal court to dismiss the lawsuit on the grounds that the city was acting to protect the health and welfare of its residents and visitors. In February 2016, the judge denied the city's request, and the lawsuit will go forward. Protect South Portland activists are continuing to organize initiatives that protect the health and welfare of their neighbors. They have directed the Council's attention to the dangers of pesticides and chemical fertilizers, resulting in the Council ordering that an ordinance be drafted that would restrict the use of pesticides. Protect South Portland is also supporting neighbors of a rail yard in making sure that siting of a propane facility is at a safe distance from residents and school children.
So it's really a joy to be an activist. It makes you feel good. It makes you feel part of the world and like you're making a difference.
We're creating our own kind of agency in this situation that demonstrates that the will to change the world does not lie with those who necessarily have the privilege to do it, but lies with those who have the courage to do it. It's not politicians or international negotiators deciding that we're going to address climate change finally. It's you and me and our families and our friends deciding that this is the way that we're going to think about our world now. This is the kind of culture that we're going to live in.
It gives me a lot of hope despite the enormity of it all, because I keep remembering our traditional teachings, and there's a story in our tradition about the 7 fires prophecies. And these prophecies of the 7 fires were ancient prophecies that were told and retold for countless generations, and they talk about different eras or epochs in history that Native peoples were going to have to endure. And they predicted the coming of the white man. They predicted religious persecution. They predicted the loss of our land. And they predicted the taking of our children. And they predicted this grave situation of the water. And so each era or epoch that we live through is called a fire. And the 7th fire of the 7 fire prophecies describes a time when the rivers will run bitter with disrespect, and the sea would turn black and the fish would become too poisoned to eat. And it's evident from our situation here with the EPA, with the fight for the state government, that that time is now. And what was to come after the 7 fires prophecies was a period of great hope. Some elders have referred to it as the great healing, when all people were going to come together and we were going to realize our common grounds or our common waters. And that was the only way that an 8th fire could be lit. So an 8th fire is up to us. It's what we do or don't do. And so I like to remind people that we are writing our grandchildren's history, and we want it to be one that they'll be proud of, and that our ancestors will be proud of.
I'm told he's here. I still don't see him, and I see him. I didn't hear him, so I couldn't believe he was here. So I am presenting a certificate, a Lifetime Achievement Award, and it says, in recognition of sustained effort and extraordinary valor in the fight against nuclear power, a teacher to us all, Gary Sachs.
Whoa!
Gary Sachs is known for his exactitude and outspokenness from Burlington to Brattleboro and beyond. Excelling in one-to-one outreach, he has been the Coalition's best fundraiser and member outreach person, and we are truly grateful to Gary. Thank you, Gary, for all you have done. We love you. And then cha-ching, cha-ching,
there's the shot,
cha-ching. And I think Gary was going to say something, and then what did you want to say? And then everyone, and then
question and answers.
Anyone want to ask Gary one question? Any question for Gary?
I just want to say thank you.
Huh, there we go. Well, the idea was when Gary came up to say something, everyone was going to heckle Gary. Gary, oh no, everyone was going to heckle Gary.
That's right.
Go ahead, try and say something.
I'll try it. So, thank you for giving me this gift. I need
That's not true.
$300 a week is what I'm looking for about now.
That's not true.
Okay, well, that's not in the contract anyway.
Got a service dog.
Yes, of course. Emotional support dog. Thank you, Clay.
I think when I asked him if he could come to receive an award, he thought, come on. I could tell he was looking at me like, come on, what's this about? Nah.
That's true. Well, it's very strange to get an award from an organization that fires you for doing what they're giving you an award for.
Probably Gary's the only person that could receive that award.
That would be me, Clay.
The teacher.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have another certificate, and this is in recognition of sustained effort and extraordinary valor, who, along with her husband, late husband, have served on the board of New England Coalition and has been the connection between solar people all over and those in the anti-nuclear fight. Her voice has been heard by many in publications, including the most recent edition of Time magazine. She has been a motherly figure and provided guidance and a steady keel to all of us. Thank you, Carol. And it may be a plastic frame, but we were definitely going to get it framed, Carol. There's no way we were not going to get it framed. Click, 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 click. That's our PR show photos.
Well, I want to thank Clay and the Coalition and everybody for this award. I'm receiving it for not only myself but my husband, because he was on the Coalition board many years before Clay nominated me. at one annual meeting. The sort of current situation, which some of you may know and others may not, but Rich died 4.5 years ago from multiple myeloma with amyloidosis, which is a cancer of the bone marrow system, with attacking his throat, swallowing, and his heart, which is what he ultimately died from. It just seems like uncanny that two of us in the same household have had cancer. I have been just diagnosed with lymphoma. I start chemotherapy on November 1st. Mine is non-Hodgkin's, one of maybe 30 different kinds of non-Hodgkin's. And I've had it from several people that by spring I will be well. So, and then it has a 75 to 80% chance of full recovery. So I just think it's ironic. We bought the house 35 or so years ago, and it is within the 10-mile zone of Vermont, Yankee. And we had, the whole time we were out there, a solar business, which Rich finally decided that he was a pioneer. And he would love to see all these solar farms that are happening now and the explosion of solar. I mean, we were selling 200-watt systems, 2 100-watt panels, and having champagne because a remote site would have, you know, lights and a fan, and they could recharge their battery, their phone, you know, and stuff like that. So he would love to see what's going on now. And so I thank you very, very much. I was on the board for a little while, but right now I'm selling my house. I have my health issues and trying to get my son to be able to buy into independent living. We each have an apartment in Brattleboro. Mine is on Tyler Street and his is on Frost Street. So this is a new era for us, and we hope that the closing will be, in the contract it says no later than November 30th, but we're all hoping that it's going to be before November 15th so that they can move in and have Thanksgiving in their new house. I hope their house does them as well as it did us, except for the experiences with cancer. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. See, this is a person who just, sure, I can do it. Carol, would you like to present this one? Sure, I'll do that.
Sure, I can read. I learned in like 3rd grade. This certificate awarded to Leslie Sullivan Sachs, who unfortunately wasn't able to make it tonight. She's here. Oh, wonderful. So Leslie, let me present this to you. In recognition of sustained effort and extraordinary valor in the fight against nuclear power, after stewarding environmental law students for 25 years, Leslie went on to organize countless demonstrations, actions, such as the famed flotilla. In addition, she has also been an important part of Safe and Green campaign. She has been the longtime leader and organizer for Safe and Green campaign. Last but not least, Leslie and her partner Gary, her husband Gary. Thank you. I didn't get to the wedding, but I got to the re-wedding, the 5-year celebration. Generously opened their home to many activists as a stopping off point after a meeting or demonstrations. Thank you, Larry, for all you've done. Signed by Ned Childs and Jake Stewart.
Thank you, Carol. I'm truly humbled to be accepting this on the same stage as you, Carol, because you deserve this. Well,
She's been our leader of public demonstrations, out there in front of people, organizing. And Leslie, I absolutely appreciate everything that you've done for us.
Well, like Deb Katz would say, the only way to fight this is death by 1,000 cuts. And the New England Coalition, with its legal arm, science arm, starting 40 years ago, and activists over 40 years, and legislators, and lobbyists, death by 1,000 cuts. It took all of us. So I'm accepting this award, the legacy of 40 years of legal eagles and activists behind me. And I'm very appreciative and proud. Thank you.